Section 1 of A Romance of Two Worlds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Romance of Two Worlds by Marie Corelli. Prologue. We live in an age of universal inquiry, ergo of universal skepticism. The prophecies of the poet, the dreams of the philosopher and scientist, are being daily realized. Things formerly considered mere fairy tales have become facts. Yet, in spite of the marvels of learning and science that are hourly accomplished among us, the attitude of mankind is one of disbelief. "There is no God," cries one theorist, or if there be one, I can obtain no proof of his existence. "There is no Creator," exclaims another. "The universe is simply a rushing together of atoms." "There can be no immortality," asserts a third. "We are but dust, and to dust we shall return." "What is called by idealists the soul," argues another, "is simply the vital principle composed of heat and air, which escapes from the body at death, and mingles again with its native element. A candle, when lit, emits flame. Blow out the light, the flame vanishes. Where? Would it not be madness to assert the flame immortal? Yet the soul, or vital principle of human existence, is no more than the flame of a candle." If you propound to these theorists the eternal question, Why? Why is the world in existence? Why is there a universe? Why do we live? Why do we think and plan? Why do we perish at the last? Their grandiose reply is, "Because of the law of universal necessity." They cannot explain this mysterious law to themselves, nor can they probe deep enough to find the answer to a still more tremendous Why. Namely, why is there a law of universal necessity? But they are satisfied with the result of their reasonings, if not wholly, yet in part, and seldom try to search beyond that great vague vast necessity, lest their finite brains should reel into madness worse than death. Recognizing, therefore, that in this cultivated age a wall of skepticism and cynicism is gradually being built up by intellectual thinkers of every nation against all that treats of the supernatural and unseen, I am aware that my narration of the events I have recently experienced will be read with incredulity. At a time when the great empire of the Christian religion is being assailed or politely ignored by governments and public speakers and teachers, I realize to the fullest extent how daring is any attempt to prove, even by a plain history of strange occurrences happening to one's self, the actual existence of the supernatural around us, and the absolute certainty of a future state of being after the passage through that brief soul torpor in which the body perishes, known to us as death. In the present narration, which I have purposely called a romance, I do not expect to be believed, as I can only relate what I myself have experienced. I know that men and women of to-day must have proofs, or what they are willing to accept as proofs, before they will credit anything that purports to be of a spiritual tendency. Something startling, some miracle of a stupendous nature, such as according to prophecy they are all unfit to receive. Few will admit the subtle influence and incontestable, though mysterious, authority exercised upon their lives by higher intelligences than their own, intelligences unseen, unknown, but felt, yes, felt by the most careless, the most cynical, in the uncomfortable prescience of the danger, the inner forebodings of guilt, the moral and mental torture endured by those who fight a protracted battle to gain the hardly won victory in themselves of right over wrong, in the 1,001 sudden appeals made without warning to that compass of a man's life, conscience, and in those brilliant and startling impulses of generosity, bravery, and self-sacrifice which carry us on, heedless of consequences, to the performance of great and noble deeds, whose fame makes the whole world one resounding echo of glory, deeds that we wonder at ourselves even in the performance of them, acts of heroism in which mere life goes for nothing, and the soul for a brief space is preeminent, obeying blindly the guiding influence of a something akin to itself, yet higher in the realms of thought. There are no proofs as to why such things should be, but that they are is indubitable. The miracles enacted now are silent ones, and are worked in the heart and mind of man alone. Unbelief is nearly supreme in the world to-day. Were an angel to descend from heaven in the middle of a great square, the crowd would think he had got himself up on pulleys and wires, and would try to discover his apparatus. Were he, in wrath, to cast destruction upon them, and with fire blazing from his wings, slay 1,000 of them with the mere shaking of a pinion, those who were left alive would either say that a tremendous dynamite explosion had occurred, or that the square was built on an extinct volcano which had suddenly broken out into frightful activity. Anything rather than believe in angels! The 19th century protests against the possibility of their existence. It sees no miracle. It pooh-poohs the very enthusiasm that might work them. "Give a positive sign," it says. "Prove clearly that what you say is true, and I, in spite of my progress in atom theory, will believe." The answer to such a request was spoken 1800 years and more ago. A faithless and perverse generation asketh for a sign, and no sign shall be given unto them. Were I now to assert that a sign had been given to me, as one out of the thousands who demand it, such daring assurance on my part would meet with the most strenuous opposition from all who peruse the following pages. Each person who reads having his own ideas on all subjects, and naturally considering them to be the best, if not the only ideas worth anything. Therefore, I wish it to be plainly understood that in this book I personally advocate no new theory of either religion or philosophy, nor do I hold myself answerable for the opinions expressed by any of my characters. My aim throughout is to let facts speak for themselves. If they seem strange, unreal, even impossible, I can only say that the things of the invisible world must always appear so to those whose thoughts and desires are centered on this life only. End of Section 1. End of Prologue. Section 2 of A Romance of Two Worlds, by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. An Artist's Studio. In the winter of 1880 , I was afflicted by a series of nervous ailments, brought on by overwork and overworry. Chief among these was a protracted and terrible insomnia, accompanied by the utmost oppression of spirits and anxiety of mind. I became filled with the gloomiest anticipations of evil, and my system was strung up by slow degrees to such a high tension of physical and mental excitement, that the quietest and most soothing of friendly voices had no other effect upon me than to jar and irritate. Work was impossible; music, my one passion, intolerable; books became wearisome to my sight; and even a short walk in the open air brought with it such lassitude and exhaustion that I soon grew to dislike the very thought of moving out of doors. In such a condition of health, medical aid became necessary, and a skillful and amiable physician, Dr. R., of great repute in nervous ailments, attended me for many weeks, but with slight success. He was not to blame, poor man, for his failure to effect a cure. He had only one way of treatment, and he applied it to all his patients with more or less happy results. Some died, some recovered. It was a lottery on which my medical friend staked his reputation, and won. The patients who died were never heard of more. Those who recovered sang the praises of their physician everywhere, and sent him gifts of silver plate and hampers of wine to testify their gratitude. His popularity was very great, his skill considered marvelous, and his inability to do me any good arose, I must perforce imagine, out of some defect or hidden obstinacy in my constitution, which was to him a new experience, and for which he was unprepared. Poor Dr. R.! how many bottles of your tastily prepared and expensive medicines have I not swallowed, in blind confidence and blinder ignorance of the offences I thus committed against all the principles of that nature within me, which, if left to itself, always heroically struggles to recover its own proper balance and effect its own cure, but which, if subjected to the experimental tests of various poisons or drugs, often loses strength in the unnatural contest and sinks exhausted, perhaps never to rise with actual vigor again. Baffled in his attempts to remedy my ailments, Dr. R at last resorted to the usual plan adopted by all physicians when their medicines have no power. He recommended change of air and scene, and urged my leaving London, then dark with fogs of a dreary winter, for the gaiety and sunshine and roses of the Riviera. The idea was not unpleasant to me, and I determined to take the advice proffered. Hearing of my intention, some American friends of mine, Colonel Everard and his charming young wife, decided to accompany me, sharing with me the expenses of the journey and hotel accommodation. We left London all together on a damp, foggy evening, when the cold was so intense that it seemed to bite the flesh like the sharp teeth of an animal, and after 2 days' rapid journey, during which I felt my spirits gradually rising, and my gloomy forebodings vanishing slowly, one by one, we arrived at Cannes, and put up at the Hotel de L. It was a lovely place, and most beautifully situated. The garden was a perfect wilderness of roses in full bloom, and an avenue of orange trees, beginning to flower, cast a delicate fragrance on the warm, delicious air. Mrs. Everard was delighted. "If you do not recover your health here," said she half laughingly to me on the second morning after our arrival, "I am afraid your case is hopeless. What sunshine! What a balmy wind! It is enough to make a cripple cast away his crutches and forget he was ever lame. Don't you think so?" I smiled in answer, but inwardly I sighed. Beautiful as the scenery, the air, and the general surroundings were, I could not disguise from myself that the temporary exhilaration of my feelings, caused by the novelty and excitement of my journey to Cannes, was slowly but surely passing away. The terrible apathy, against which I had fought for so many months, was again creeping over me with its cruel and resistless force. I did my best to struggle against it. I walked, I rode, I laughed and chatted with Mrs. Everard and her husband, and forced myself into sociability with some of the visitors at the hotel, who were disposed to show us friendly attention. I summoned all my stock of will power to beat back the insidious physical and mental misery that threatened to sap the very spring of my life, and in some of these efforts I partially succeeded. But it was at night that the terrors of my condition manifested themselves. Then sleep forsook my eyes. A dull throbbing weight of pain encircled my head like a crown of thorns. Nervous terrors shook me from head to foot. Fragments of my own musical compositions hummed in my ears with wearying persistence, fragments that always left me in a state of distressed conjecture, for I never could remember how they ended, and I puzzled myself vainly over crotchets and quavers that never would consent to arrange themselves in any sort of finale. So the days went on. For Colonel Everard and his wife, those days were full of merriment, sightseeing, and enjoyment. For me, though outwardly I appeared to share in the universal gaiety, they were laden with increasing despair and wretchedness, for I began to lose hope of ever recovering my once buoyant health and strength, and what was even worse, I seemed to have utterly parted with all working ability. I was young, and up to within a few months life had stretched brightly before me, with the prospect of a brilliant career, and now what was I? A wretched invalid, a burden to myself and to others, a broken spar flung with other fragments of shipwrecked lives on the great ocean of time, there to be whirled away and forgotten. But a rescue was approaching, a rescue sudden and marvelous, of which in my wildest fancies I had never dreamed. Staying in the same hotel with us was a young Italian artist, Raffaello Cellini by name. His pictures were beginning to attract a great deal of notice, both in Paris and Rome, not only for their faultless drawing, but for their wonderfully exquisite coloring. So deep and warm and rich were the hues he transferred to his canvases, that others of his art, less fortunate in the management of the palette, declared he must have invented some foreign compound whereby he was enabled to deepen and brighten his colours for the time being, but that the effect was only temporary, and that his pictures, exposed to the air for some 8 or 10 years, would fade away rapidly, leaving only the traces of an indistinct blur. Others, more generous, congratulated him on having discovered the secrets of the old masters. In short, he was admired, condemned, envied, and flattered, all in a breath; while he himself, being of a singularly serene and unruffled disposition, worked away incessantly, caring little or nothing for the world's praise or blame. Cellini had a pretty suite of rooms in the Hotel de L , and my friends Colonel and Mrs. Everard fraternized with him very warmly. He was by no means slow to respond to their overtures of friendship, and so it happened that his studio became a sort of lounge for us, where we would meet to have tea, to chat, to look at the pictures, or to discuss our plans for future enjoyment. These visits to Cellini's studio, strange to say, had a remarkable soothing and calming effect upon my suffering nerves. The lofty and elegant room, furnished with that admired disorder and mixed luxuriousness peculiar to artists, with its heavy drooping velvet curtains, its glimpses of white marble busts and broken columns, its flash and fragrance of flowers that bloomed in a tiny conservatory opening out from the studio and leading to the garden, where a fountain bubbled melodiously, all this pleased me and gave me a curious, yet most welcome, sense of absolute rest. Cellini himself had a fascination for me, for exactly the same reason. As an example of this, I remember escaping from Mrs. Everard on one occasion, and hurrying to the most secluded part of the garden in order to walk up and down alone, in an endeavour to calm an attack of nervous agitation which had suddenly seized me. While thus pacing about in feverish restlessness, I saw Cellini approaching, his head bent as if in thought, and his hands clasped behind his back. As he drew near me, he raised his eyes. They were clear and darkly brilliant. He regarded me steadfastly, with a kindly smile. Then lifting his hat with the graceful reverence peculiar to an Italian, he passed on, saying no word, but the effect of his momentary presence upon me was remarkable. It was electric. I was no longer agitated. Calmed, soothed, and almost happy, I returned to Mrs. Everard, and entered into her plans for the day with so much alacrity that she was surprised and delighted. "If you go on like this," she said, "you will be perfectly well in a month." I was utterly unable to account for the remedial influence Raffaello Cellini's presence had upon me, but such as it was, I could not but be grateful for the respite it gave me from nervous suffering, and my now daily visits to the artist's studio were a pleasure and a privilege not to be foregone. Moreover, I was never tired of looking at his pictures. His subjects were all original, and some of them were very weird and fantastic. One large picture particularly attracted me. It was entitled "Lords of our Life and Death." Surrounded by rolling masses of cloud, some silver crested, some shot through with red flame, was depicted the world, as a globe half in light, half in shade. Poised above it was a great angel, upon whose calm and noble face rested a mingled expression of deep sorrow, yearning pity, and infinite regret. Tears seemed to glitter on the drooping eyelashes of this sweet yet stern spirit, and in his strong right hand he held a drawn sword, the sword of destruction, pointed forever downwards to the fated globe at his feet. Beneath this angel and the world he dominated was darkness, utter, illimitable darkness. But above him the clouds were torn asunder, and through a transparent veil of light golden mist a face of surpassing beauty was seen, a face on which youth, health, hope, love, and ecstatic joy all shone with ineffable radiance. It was the personification of life, not life as we know it, brief and full of care, but life immortal and love triumphant. Often and often I found myself standing before this masterpiece of Cellini's genius, gazing at it, not only with admiration, but with a sense of actual comfort. One afternoon, while resting in my favorite low chair opposite the picture, I roused myself from a reverie, and turning to the artist, who was showing some water color sketches to Mrs. Everard, I said abruptly, Did you imagine that face of the Angel of Life, Signor Cellini, or had you a model to copy from?" He looked at me and smiled. "It is a moderately good portrait of an existing original," he said. "A woman's face, then, I suppose? How very beautiful she must be!" "Actual beauty is sexless," he replied, and was silent. The expression of his face had become abstracted and dreamy, and he turned over the sketches for Mrs. Everard with an air which showed his thoughts to be far away from his occupation. "And the Death Angel," I went on, "had you a model for that also?" This time a look of relief, almost of gladness, passed over his features. "No, indeed," he answered with ready frankness. "That is entirely my own creation." I was about to compliment him on the grandeur and force of his poetical fancy, when he stopped me by a slight gesture of his hand. "If you really admire the picture," he said, "pray do not say so. If it is in truth a work of art, let it speak to you as art only, and spare the poor workman who has called it into existence the shame of having to confess that it is not above human praise. The only true criticism of high art is silence, silence as grand as heaven itself." He spoke with energy, and his dark eyes flashed. Amy, Mrs. Everard, looked at him curiously. "Say now," she exclaimed with a ringing laugh, "aren't you a little bit eccentric, Signor? You talk like a long-haired prophet. I never met an artist before who couldn't stand praise. It is generally a matter of wonder to me to notice how much of that intoxicating sweet they can swallow without reeling. But you're an exception, I must admit. I congratulate you." Cellini bowed gaily in response to the half friendly, half mocking curtsy she gave him, and turning to me again, said, "I have a favour to ask of you, mademoiselle. Will you sit to me for your portrait?" "I!" I exclaimed with astonishment. "Signor Cellini, I cannot imagine why you would wish so to waste your valuable time. There is nothing in my poor physiognomy worthy of your briefest attention." "You must pardon me, mademoiselle," he replied gravely, "if I presume to differ from you. I am exceedingly anxious to transfer your features to my canvas. I am aware that you are not in strong health, and that your face has not that roundness and colour formerly habitual to it. But I am not an admirer of the milkmaid type of beauty. Everywhere I seek for intelligence, for thought, for inward refinement. In short, mademoiselle, you have the face of one whom the inner soul consumes, and as such, may I plead again with you to give me a little of your spare time? You will not regret it, I assure you." These last words were uttered in a lower tone with singular impressiveness. I rose from my seat and looked at him steadily. He returned me glance for glance. A strange thrill ran through me, followed by that inexplicable sensation of absolute calm that I had before experienced. I smiled. I could not help smiling. "I will come to-morrow," I said. "A thousand thanks, mademoiselle. Can you be here at noon?" I looked inquiringly at Amy, who clapped her hands with delighted enthusiasm. "Of course, any time you like, Signor. We will arrange our excursions so that they shall not interfere with the sittings. It will be most interesting to watch the picture growing day by day. What will you call it, Signor? By some fancy title?" "It will depend on its appearance when completed," he replied, as he threw open the doors of the studio and bowed us out with his usual ceremonious politeness. "Au revoir, madame. À demain, mademoiselle." And the violet velvet curtains of the portière fell softly behind us as we made our exit. "Is there not something strange about that young man?" said Mrs. Everard, as we walked through the long gallery of the Hotel de L back to our own rooms. "Something fiendish or angelic, or a little of both qualities mixed up." "I think he is what people term peculiar, when they fail to understand the poetical vagaries of genius," I replied. "He is certainly very uncommon." "Well," continued my friend meditatively, as she contemplated her pretty mignon face and graceful figure in a long mirror placed attractively in a corner of the hall through which we were passing, "all I can say is that I wouldn't let him paint my portrait if he were to ask ever so. I should be scared to death. I wonder you, being so nervous, were not afraid of him." "I thought you liked him," I said. "So I do. So does my husband. He's awfully handsome and clever and all that, but his conversation! There now, my dear, you must own he is slightly queer. Why, who but a lunatic would say that the only criticism of art is silence? Isn't that utter rubbish?" "The only true criticism," I corrected her gently. "Well, it's all the same. How can there be any criticism at all in silence? According to his idea, when we admire anything very much we ought to go round with long faces and gags on our mouths. That would be entirely ridiculous. And what was that dreadful thing he said to you?" "I don't quite understand you," I answered. "I can't remember his saying anything dreadful." "Oh, I have it now," continued Amy with rapidity. "It was awful. He said you had the face of one whom the soul consumes. You know, that was most horribly mystical. And when he said it he looked ghastly. What did he mean by it, I wonder?" I made no answer, but I thought I knew. I changed the conversation as soon as possible, and my volatile American friend was soon absorbed in a discussion on dress and jewelry. That night was a blessed one for me. I was free from all suffering, and slept as calmly as a child, while in my dreams the face of Cellini's Angel of Life smiled at me, and seemed to suggest peace. End of chapter 1. Section 3 of A Romance of Two Worlds, by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2: The Mysterious Potion. The next day, punctually at noon, according to my promise, I entered the studio. I was alone, for Amy, after some qualms of conscience respecting chaperonage, propriety, and Mrs. Grundy, had yielded to my entreaties and gone for a drive with some friends. In spite of the fears she began to entertain concerning the Mephistophelian character of Raffaello Cellini, there was one thing of which both she and I felt morally certain, namely, that no truer or more honorable gentleman than he ever walked on the earth. Under his protection the loveliest and loneliest woman that ever lived would have been perfectly safe, as though she were shut up, like the princess in the fairy tale, in a brazen tower of which only an undiscoverable serpent possessed the key. When I arrived the rooms were deserted, save for the presence of a magnificent Newfoundland dog, who, as I entered, rose, and shaking his shaggy body, sat down before me and offered me his huge paw, wagging his tail in the most friendly manner all the while. I at once responded to his cordial greeting, and as I stroked his noble head I wondered where the animal had come from, for though we had visited Signor Cellini's studio every day, there had been no sign or mention of this stately, brown-eyed, four-footed companion. I seated myself, and the dog immediately lay down at my feet, every now and then looking up at me with an affectionate glance and a renewed wagging of his tail. Glancing round the well-known room, I noticed that the picture I admired so much was veiled by a curtain of Oriental stuff, in which were embroidered threads of gold mingled with silks of various brilliant hues. On the working easel was a large square canvas, already prepared, as I supposed, for my features to be traced thereon. It was an exceedingly warm morning, and though the windows as well as the glass doors of the conservatory were wide open, I found the air of the studio very oppressive. I perceived on the table a finely wrought decanter of Venetian glass, in which clear water sparkled temptingly. Rising from my chair, I took an antique silver goblet from the mantelpiece, filled it with the cool fluid, and was about to drink, when the cup was suddenly snatched from my hands, and the voice of Cellini, changed from its usual softness to a tone both imperious and commanding, startled me. "Do not drink that!" he said. "You must not! You dare not! I forbid you!" I looked up at him in mute astonishment. His face was very pale, and his large dark eyes shone with suppressed excitement. Slowly my self possession returned to me, and I said calmly: "You forbid me, Signor? Surely you forget yourself. What harm have I done in helping myself to a simple glass of water in your studio? You are not usually so inhospitable." While I spoke his manner changed, the color returned to his face, and his eyes softened. He smiled. Forgive me, mademoiselle, for my brusquerie. It is true I forgot myself for a moment. But you were in danger, and—" "In danger!" I exclaimed incredulously. "Yes, mademoiselle, this," and he held up the Venetian decanter to the light, "is not water simply. If you will observe it now, with the sunshine beating full against it, I think you will perceive peculiarities in it that will assure you of my veracity." I looked as he bade me, and saw, to my surprise, that the fluid was never actually still for a second. A sort of internal bubbling seemed to work in its centre, and curious specks and lines of crimson and gold flashed through it from time to time. "What is it?" I asked, adding with a half smile, "Are you the possessor of a specimen of the far famed Aqua Tofana?" Cellini placed the decanter carefully on a shelf, and I noticed that he chose a particular spot for it, where the rays of the sun could fall perpendicularly upon the vessel containing it. Then, turning to me, he replied: "Aqua Tofana, mademoiselle, is a deadly poison, known to the ancients and also to many learned chemists of our day. It is a clear and colourless liquid, but it is absolutely still as a stagnant pool. What I have just shown you is not poison, but quite the reverse. I will prove this to you at once." And taking a tiny liqueur glass from a side table, he filled it with the strange fluid and drank it off, carefully replacing the stopper in the decanter. "But, Signor Cellini," I urged, "if it is so harmless, why did you forbid my tasting it? Why did you say there was danger for me when I was about to drink it?" "Because, mademoiselle, for you it would be dangerous. Your health is weak, your nerves unstrung. That elixir is a powerful vivifying tonic, acting with great rapidity on the entire system, and rushing through the veins with the swiftness of electricity. I am accustomed to it; it is my daily medicine. But I was brought to it by slow and almost imperceptible degrees. A single teaspoonful of that fluid, mademoiselle, administered to anyone not prepared to receive it, would be instant death, though its actual use is to vivify and strengthen human life. You understand now why I said you were in danger?" "I understand," I replied, though in sober truth I was mystified and puzzled. "And you forgive my seeming rudeness?" "Oh, certainly. But you have aroused my curiosity. I should like to know more about this strange medicine of yours." "You shall know more if you wish," said Cellini, his usual equable humour and good spirits now quite restored. "You shall know everything. But not to day. We have too little time. I have not yet commenced your picture, and I forgot you were thirsty, and I was, as you said, inhospitable. You must permit me to repair my fault." And with a courteous salute he left the room, to return almost immediately with a tumbler full of some fragrant golden coloured liquid, in which lumps of ice glittered refreshingly. A few loose rose leaves were scattered on the top of this dainty looking beverage. "You may enjoy this without fear," said he, smiling. "It will do you good. It is an Eastern wine unknown to trade, and therefore untampered with. I see you are looking at the rose leaves on the surface. That is a Persian custom, and I think a pretty one. They float away from your lips in the action of drinking, and therefore they are no obstacle." I tasted the wine, and I found it delicious, soft and mellow as summer moonlight. While I sipped it, the big Newfoundland, who had stretched himself in a couchant posture on the hearthrug ever since Cellini had first entered the room, rose and walked majestically to my side, and rubbed his head caressingly against the folds of my dress. "Leo has made friends with you, I see," said Cellini. "You should take that as a great compliment, for he is most particular in his choice of acquaintance, and most steadfast when he has once made up his mind. He has more decision of character than many a statesman." "How is it we have never seen him before?" I inquired. "You never told us you had such a splendid companion." "I am not his master," replied the artist. "He only favours me with a visit occasionally. He arrived from Paris last night, and came straight here, sure of his welcome. He does not confide his plans to me, but I suppose he will return to his home when he thinks it advisable. He knows his business best." I laughed. What a clever dog! Does he journey on foot, or does he take the train?" "I believe he generally patronizes the railway. All the officials know him, and he gets into the guard's van as a matter of course. Sometimes he will alight at a station en route and walk the rest of the way. But if he is lazily inclined, he does not stir till the train reaches its destination. At the end of every 6 months or so, the railway authorities send the bill of Leo's journeyings in to his master, when it is always settled without difficulty." "And who is his master?" I ventured to ask. Cellini's face grew serious and absorbed, and his eyes were full of grave contemplation as he answered: "His master, mademoiselle, is my master. One who among men is supremely intelligent, among teachers absolutely unselfish, among thinkers purely impersonal, among friends inflexibly faithful. To him I owe everything, even life itself. For him no sacrifice, no extreme devotion would be too great could I hope thereby to show my gratitude. But he is as far above human thanks or human rewards as the sun is above the sea. Not here, not now, dare I say to him, 'My friend, behold how much I love thee.' Such language would be all too poor and unmeaning. But hereafter, who knows?" And he broke off abruptly with a half sigh. Then, as if forcing himself to change the tenor of his thoughts, he continued in a kind tone: "But, mademoiselle, I am wasting your time, and am taking no advantage of the favour you have shown me by your presence to day. Will you seat yourself here?" And he placed an elaborately carved oaken settee in one corner of the studio, opposite his own easel. "I should be sorry to fatigue you at all," he went on. "Do you care for reading?" I answered eagerly in the affirmative, and he handed me a volume bound in curiously embossed leather, and ornamented with silver clasps. It was entitled "Letters of a Dead Musician." "You will find clear gems of thought, passion, and feeling in this book," said Cellini; "and being a musician yourself, you will know how to appreciate them. The writer was one of those geniuses whose work the world repays with ridicule and contempt. There is no fate more enviable." I looked at the artist with some surprise as I took the volume he recommended, and seated myself in the position he indicated; and while he busied himself in arranging the velvet curtains behind me as a background, I said: "Do you really consider it enviable, Signor Cellini, to receive the world's ridicule and contempt?" "I do indeed," he replied, "since it is a certain proof that the world does not understand you. To achieve something that is above human comprehension, that is greatness. To have the serene sublimity of the God man Christ, and consent to be crucified by a gibing world that was fated to be afterwards civilized and dominated by His teachings, what can be more glorious? To have the magnificent versatility of a Shakespeare, who was scarcely recognized in his own day, but whose gifts were so vast and various that the silly multitudes wrangle over his very identity and the authenticity of his plays to this hour, what can be more triumphant? To know that one's own soul can, if strengthened and encouraged by the force of will, rise to a supreme altitude of power, is not that sufficient to compensate for the little whining cries of the common herd of men and women who have forgotten whether they ever had a spiritual spark in them, and who, straining up to see the light of genius that burns too fiercely for their earth dimmed eyes, exclaim, 'We see nothing, therefore there can be nothing'? Ah, mademoiselle, the knowledge of one's own inner self existence is a knowledge surpassing all the marvels of art and science." Cellini spoke with enthusiasm, and his countenance seemed illumined by the eloquence that warmed his speech. I listened with a sort of dreamy satisfaction. The visual sensation of utter rest that I always experienced in this man's presence was upon me, and I watched him with interest as he drew with quick and facile touch the outline of my features on his canvas. Gradually he became more and more absorbed in his work. He glanced at me from time to time, but did not speak, and his pencil worked rapidly. I turned over the Letters of a Dead Musician with some curiosity. Several passages struck me as being remarkable for their originality and depth of thought, but what particularly impressed me as I read on was the tone of absolute joy and contentment that seemed to light up every page. There were no wailings over disappointed ambition, no regrets for the past, no complaints, no criticism, no word for or against the brothers of his art. Everything was treated from a lofty standpoint of splendid equality, save when the writer spoke of himself, and then he became the humblest of the humble, yet never abject, and always happy. "O Music," he wrote, "Music, thou sweetest spirit of all that serve God, what have I done that thou shouldst so often visit me? It is not well, O thou lofty and divine one, that thou shouldst stoop so low as to console him who is the unworthiest of all thy servants. For I am too feeble to tell the world how soft is the sound of thy rustling pinions, how tender is the sighing breath of thy lips, how beyond all things glorious is the vibration of thy lightest whisper. Remain aloft, thou choicest essence of the Creator's voice; remain in that pure and cloudless ether, where alone thou art fitted to dwell. My touch must desecrate thee, my voice affright thee. Suffice it to thy servant, O beloved, to dream of thee and die." Meeting Cellini's glance as I finished reading these lines, I asked: "Did you know the author of this book, Signor?" "I knew him well," he replied. "He was one of the gentlest souls that ever dwelt in human clay. As ethereal in his music as John Keats in his poetry, he was one of those creatures born of dreams and rapture that rarely visit this planet. Happy fellow! What a death was his!" "How did he die?" I inquired. "He was playing the organ in one of the great churches of Rome on the day of the Feast of the Virgin. A choir of finely trained voices sang to his accompaniment his own glorious setting of the Regina Coeli. The music was wonderful, startling, triumphant, ever rising in power and majesty to a magnificent finale, when suddenly a slight crash was heard, the organ ceased abruptly, the singers broke off, the musician was dead. He had fallen forward on the keys of the instrument, and when they raised him, his face was fairer than the face of any sculptured angel, so serene was its expression, so rapt was its smile. No one could tell exactly the cause of his death. He had always been remarkably strong and healthy. Everyone said it was heart disease. It is the usual reason assigned by medical savants for these sudden departures out of the world. His loss was regretted by all, save myself and one other who loved him. We rejoiced, and still do rejoice, at his release." I speculated vaguely on the meaning of these last words, but I felt disinclined to ask any more questions, and Cellini, probably seeing this, worked on at his sketch without further converse. My eyes were growing heavy, and the printed words in the dead musician's letters danced before my sight like active little black demons with thin waving arms and legs. A curious, not unpleasant drowsiness stole over me, in which I heard the humming of the bees at the open window, the singing of the birds, and the voices of people in the hotel gardens, all united in one continuous murmur that seemed a long way off. I saw the sunshine and the shadow. I saw the majestic Leo stretched full length near the easel, and the slight supple form of Raffaello Cellini standing out in bold outline against the light. Yet all seemed shifting and mingling strangely into a sort of wide radiance in which there was nothing but varying tints of colour. And could it have been my fancy, or did I actually see the curtain fall gradually away from my favourite picture, just enough for the face of the Angel of Life to be seen smiling down upon me? I rubbed my eyes violently, and started to my feet at the sound of the artist's voice. "I have tried your patience enough for to day," he said, and his words sounded muffled, as though they were being spoken through a thick wall. "You can leave me now if you like." I stood before him mechanically, still holding the book he had lent me clasped in my hand. Irresolutely I raised my eyes towards the Lords of our life and death. It was closely veiled. I had then experienced an optical illusion. I forced myself to speak, to smile, to put back the novel sensations that were overwhelming me. "I think," I said, and I heard myself speak as though I were somebody else at a great distance off, "I think, Signor Cellini, your Eastern wine has been too potent for me. My head is quite heavy, and I feel dazed." "It is mere fatigue and the heat of the day," he replied quietly. I am sure you are not too dazed, as you call it, to see your favorite picture, are you?" I trembled. Was not that picture veiled? I looked. There was no curtain at all, and the faces of the two angels shone out of the canvas with intense brilliancy. Strange to say, I felt no surprise at this circumstance, which, had it occurred a moment previously, would have unquestionably astonished and perhaps alarmed me. The mistiness of my brain suddenly cleared. I saw everything plainly, I heard distinctly, and when I spoke the tone of my voice sounded as full and ringing as it had previously seemed low and muffled. I gazed steadfastly at the painting, and replied, half smiling: "I should be indeed 'far gone,' as the saying is, if I could not see that, Signor. It is truly your masterpiece. Why have you never exhibited it?" "Can you ask that?" he said with impressive emphasis, at the same time drawing nearer and fixing upon me the penetrating glance of his dark, fathomless eyes. It then seemed to me that some great inner force compelled me to answer this half inquiry, in words of which I had taken no previous thought, and which, as I uttered them, conveyed no special meaning to my own ears. "Of course," I said slowly, as if I were repeating a lesson, "you would not so betray the high trust committed to your charge." "Well said!" replied Cellini. "You are fatigued, mademoiselle. Au revoir till to morrow." And throwing open the door of his studio, he stood aside for me to pass out. I looked at him inquiringly. "Must I come at the same time to morrow?" I asked. "If you please." I passed my hand across my forehead perplexedly. I felt I had something else to say before I left him. He waited patiently, holding back with one hand the curtains of the portiere. "I think I had a parting word to give you," I said at last, meeting his gaze frankly, "but I seem to have forgotten what it was." Cellini smiled gravely. "Do not trouble to think about it, mademoiselle. I am unworthy the effort on your part." A flash of vivid light crossed my eyes for a second, and I exclaimed eagerly: "I remember now! It was 'de vous garde, Signor.'" He bent his head reverentially. "Merci mille fois, mademoiselle. Dieu vous garde, vous aussi. Au revoir." And clasping my hand with a light yet friendly pressure, he closed the door of his room behind me. Once alone in the passage, the sense of high elation and contentment that had just possessed me began gradually to decrease. I had not become actually dispirited, but a languid feeling of weariness oppressed me, and my limbs ached as though I had walked incessantly for many miles. I went straight to my room, consulted my watch. It was 1:30, the hour at which the hotel luncheon was usually served. Mrs. Everard had evidently not returned from her drive. I did not care to attend the table d'hôte alone. Besides, I had no inclination to eat. I drew down the window blinds to shut out the brilliancy of the beautiful southern sunlight, and throwing myself on my bed, I determined to rest quietly till Amy came back. I had brought the letters of a dead musician away with me from Cellini's studio, and I began to read, intending to keep myself awake by this means. But I found I could not fix my attention on the page, nor could I think at all connectedly. Little by little my eyelids closed, the book dropped from my nerveless hand, and in a few minutes I was in a deep and tranquil slumber. Chapter 3 Section 4 of A Romance of Two Worlds by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3 Three Visions. Roses, roses, an interminable chain of these royal blossoms, red and white, wreathed by the radiant fingers of small rainbow-winged creatures, as airy as moonlight mist, as delicate as thistledown. They cluster round me with smiling faces and eager eyes. They place the end of their rose garland in my hand and whisper, "Follow." Gladly I obey and hasten onward. Guiding myself by the fragrant chain I hold, I pass through a labyrinth of trees, whose luxuriant branches quiver with the flight and song of birds. Then comes the sound of waters, the riotous rushing of a torrent unchecked, that leaps sheer down from rocks 1,000 feet high, thundering forth the praise of its own beauty as it tosses in the air triumphant crowns of silver spray. How the living diamonds within it shift, and change, and sparkle! Fain would I linger to watch this magnificence, but the coil of roses still unwinds before me, and the fairy voices still cry, "Follow!" I press on. The trees grow thicker, the songs of the birds cease, the light around me grows pale and subdued. In the far distance I see a golden crescent that seems suspended by some invisible thread in the air. Is it the young moon? No, for as I gaze it breaks apart into 1,000 points of vivid light, like wandering stars. These meet, they blaze into letters of fire. I strain my dazzled eyes to spell out their meaning. They form one word, Heliobas. I read it, I utter it aloud. The rose chain breaks at my feet and disappears. The fairy voices die away on my ear. There is utter silence, utter darkness, save where that one name writes itself in burning gold on the blackness of the heavens. The interior of a vast cathedral is opened before my gaze. The lofty white marble columns support a vaulted roof painted in fresco, from which are suspended 1,000 lamps that emit a mild and steady effulgence. The great altar is illuminated. The priests in glittering raiment pace slowly to and fro. The large voice of the organ, murmuring to itself a while, breaks forth in a shout of melody, and a boy's clear sonorous treble tones pierce the incense-laden air. Credo! And the silver, trumpet-like notes fall from the immense height of the building like a bell ringing in a pure atmosphere. Credo in unum Deum, Patrum omnipotentem, factorum coeli et terrae, visibilium omnium et invisibilium. The cathedral echoes with answering voices, and involuntarily kneeling, I follow the words of the grand chant. I hear the music slacken, the notes of rejoicing change to a sobbing and remorseful wail. The organ shudders like a forest of pines in a tempest. Crucifixus etiam pro nobis passus et sepultus est. A darkness grows up around me. My senses swim. The music altogether ceases, but a brilliant radiance streams through a side door of the church, and 20 maidens, clad in white and crowned with myrtle, pacing 2 by 2, approach me. They gaze at me with joyous eyes. "Art thou also one of us?" they murmur. Then they pass onward to the altar, where again the lights are glimmering. I watch them with eager interest. I hear them uplift their fresh young voices in prayer and praise. One of them, whose deep blue eyes are full of lustrous tenderness, leaves her companions and softly approaches me. She holds a pencil and tablet in her hand. "Write," she says in a thrilling whisper, "and write quickly, for whatsoever thou shalt now inscribe is the clue to thy destiny." I obey her mechanically, impelled not by my own will, but by some unknown powerful force acting within and around me. I trace upon the tablet one word only. It is a name that startles me even while I myself write it down, Heliobas. Scarcely have I written it when a thick white cloud veils the cathedral from my sight, the fair maiden vanishes, and all is again still. I am listening to the accents of a grave melodious voice, which from its slow and measured tones would seem to be in the action of reading or reciting aloud. I see a small room sparely furnished, and at a table covered with books and manuscripts is seated a man of noble features and commanding presence. He is in the full prime of life. His dark hair has no thread of silver to mar its luxuriance. His face is unwrinkled, his forehead unfurrowed by care. His eyes, deeply sunk beneath his shelving brows, are of a singularly clear and penetrating blue, with an absorbed and watchful look in them, like the eyes of one accustomed to gaze far out at sea. His hand rests on the open pages of a massive volume. He is reading, and his expression is intent and earnest, as if he were uttering his own thoughts aloud, with the conviction and force of an orator who knows the truth of which he speaks. The universe is upheld solely by the law of love. A majestic, invisible protectorate governs the winds, the tides, the incoming and outgoing of the seasons, the birth of the flowers, the growth of forests, the outpourings of the sunlight, the silent glittering of the stars. A wide, illimitable beneficence embraces all creation. A vast, eternal pity exists for all sorrow, all sin. He who first swung the planets in the air and bade them revolve till time shall be no more, he, the fountainhead of absolute perfection, is no deaf, blind, capricious, or remorseless being. To him the death of the smallest singing bird is as great or as little as the death of a world's emperor. For him the timeless withering of an innocent flower is as pitiful as the decay of a mighty nation. An infant's first prayer to him is heard with as tender a patience as the united petitions of thousands of worshippers. For in everything, and around everything, from the sun to a grain of sand, he hath a portion, small or great, of his own most perfect existence. Should he hate his creation, he must perforce hate himself, and that love should hate love is an impossibility. Therefore he loves all his work, and as love to be perfect must contain pity, forgiveness, and forbearance, so doth he pity, forgive, and forbear. Shall a mere man deny himself for the sake of his child or friend? And shall the infinite love refuse to sacrifice itself, yea, even to as immense a humility as its greatness is immeasurable? Shall we deny those merciful attributes to God which we acknowledge in his creature, man? O my soul, rejoice that thou hast pierced the veil of the Beyond, that thou hast seen and known the truth, that to thee is made clear the reason of life and the recompense of death. Yet while rejoicing, grieve that thou art not fated to draw more than a few souls to the comfort thou hast thyself attained. Fascinated by the speaker's voice and countenance, I listen, straining my ears to catch every word that falls from his lips. He rises, he stands erect, he stretches out his hands as though in solemn entreaty. "Azul!" he exclaims, "messenger of my fate, thou who art a guiding spirit of the elements, thou who ridest the storm cloud and sittest throned on the edge of the lightning, by that electric spark within me, of which thou art the twin flame, I ask of thee to send me this one more poor human soul. Let me change its unrestfulness into repose, its hesitation to certainty, its weakness to strength, its weary imprisonment to the light of liberty. Azul!" His voice ceases, his extended hands fall slowly and gradually. Gradually he turns his whole figure towards me. He faces me. His intense eyes burn through me. His strange yet tender smile absorbs me. Yet I am full of unreasoning terror. I tremble, I strive to turn away from that searching and magnetic gaze. His deep, melodious tones again ring softly on the silence. He addresses me. "Fearest thou me, my child? Am I not thy friend? Knowest thou not the name of Heliobas?" At this word I start and gasp for breath. I would shriek, but cannot, for a heavy hand seems to close my mouth, and an immense weight presses me down. I struggle violently with this unseen power. Little by little I gain the advantage. One effort more, I win the victory. I wake. "Sakes alive!" says a familiar voice, "you have had a spell of sleep. I got home about 2, nearly starving, and I found you here curled up in a rosy infant slumber, as the song says. So I hunted up the Colonel and had lunch, for it seemed a sin to disturb you. It's just struck 4. Shall we have some tea up here?" I looked at Mrs. Everard and smiled assent. So I had been sleeping for 2 hours and a half, and I had evidently been dreaming all the time, but my dreams had been as vivid as realities. I felt still rather drowsy, but I was thoroughly rested and in a state of delicious tranquillity. My friend rang the bell for tea, and then turned round and surveyed me with a sort of wonder. "What have you done to yourself, child?" she said at last, approaching the bed where I lay, and staring fixedly at me. "What do you mean?" "Why, you look a different creature. When I left you this morning you were pale and haggard, a sort of die-away delicate invalid. Now your eyes are bright, and your cheeks have quite a lovely colour in them. Your lips, too, are the right tint. But perhaps," and here she looked alarmed, "perhaps you've got the fever." "I don't think so," I said amusedly, and I stretched out my hand for her to feel. "No, you haven't," she continued, evidently reassured. "Your palm is moist and cool, and your pulse is regular. Well, you look spry, anyhow. I shouldn't wonder if you made up your mind to have a dance to night." "Dance?" I queried. "What dance, and where?" "Well, Madame Didier, that jolly little fur bellowed Frenchwoman with whom I was driving just now, has got up a regular party to night." "Hans Breitsman give a party?" I interposed, with a mock solemn air of inquiry. Amy laughed. "Well, yes, it may be that kind of thing, for all I know to the contrary. Anyhow, she's hired the band and ordered a right down elegant supper. Half the folks in the hotel are going, and a lot of outsiders have got invitations. She asked if we couldn't come, myself, the Colonel, and you. I said I could answer for myself and the Colonel, but not for you, as you are an invalid. But if you keep on looking as you do at present, no one will believe that there's anything the matter with you. Tea, Alphonse." This to a polite waiter who was our special attendant, and who just then knocked at the door to know Madame's orders. Utterly disbelieving what my friend said in regard to my improved appearance, I rose from bed and went to the dressing table to look in the mirror and judge for myself. I almost recoiled from my own reflection, so great was my surprise. The heavy marks under my eyes, the lines of pain that had been for months deepening in my forehead, the plaintive droop of the mouth that had given me such an air of ill health and anxiety, all were gone as if by magic. I saw a rose tinted complexion, a pair of laughing, lustrous eyes, and altogether such a happy, mirthful young face smiled back at me, that I half doubted whether it was indeed myself I saw. "There now!" cried Amy in triumph, watching me as I pushed my clustering hair from my brows and examined myself more intently. "Did I not tell you so? The change in you is marvelous. I know what it is. You've been getting better unconsciously to yourself in this lovely air and scene, and the long afternoon sleep you've just had has completed the cure." I smiled at her enthusiasm, but was forced to admit that she was right as far as my actual looks went. No one would believe that I was, or ever had been, ill. In silence I loosened my hair and began to brush it and put it in order before the mirror, and as I did so my thoughts were very busy. I remembered distinctly all that had happened in the studio of Raffaello Cellini, and still more distinctly was I able to recall every detail of the 3 dreams that had visited me in my slumber. The name, too, that had been the keynote of them all I also remembered, but some instinct forbade me to utter it aloud. Once I thought, "Shall I take a pencil and write it down lest I forget it?" And the same instinct said no. Amy's voluble chatter ran on like the sound of a rippling brook all the time I thus meditated over the occurrences of the day. "Say, child," she exclaimed, "will you go to the dance?" "Certainly I will, with pleasure," I answered, and indeed I felt as if I should thoroughly enjoy it. "Brava! It will be real fun. There are no end of foreign titles coming, I believe. The Colonel's a bit grumpy about it. He always is when he has to wear his dress suit. He just hates it. That man hasn't a particle of vanity. He looks handsomer in his evening clothes than in anything else, and yet he doesn't see it. But tell me," and her pretty face became serious with a true feminine anxiety, "whatever will you wear? You've brought no ball fixings, have you?" I finished twisting up the last coil of my hair, and turned and kissed her affectionately. She was the most sweet tempered and generous of women, and she would have placed any one of her elaborate costumes at my disposal had I expressed the least desire in that direction. I answered: "No, dear, I certainly have no regular ball fixings, for I never expected to dance here, or anywhere for that matter. I did not bring the big trunks full of Parisian toilettes that you indulge in, you spoilt bride. Still, I have something that may do. In fact, it will have to do." "What is it? Have I seen it? Do show!" And her curiosity was unappeasable. The discreet Alphonse tapped at the door again just at this moment. "Entrez!" I answered, and our tea, prepared with the tempting nicety peculiar to the Hotel de L, appeared. Alphonse set the tray down with his usual artistic flourish, and produced a small note from his vest pocket. "For mademoiselle," he said with a bow, and as he handed it to me his eyes opened wide in surprise. He too perceived the change in my appearance, but he was dignity itself, and instantly suppressed his astonishment into the polite impassiveness of a truly accomplished waiter, and gliding from the room on the points of his toes, as was his usual custom, he disappeared. The note was from Cellini, and ran as follows: "If mademoiselle will be so good as to refrain from choosing any flowers for her toilette this evening, she will confer a favor on her humble friend and servant, Raffaello Cellini." I handed it to Amy, who was evidently burning with inquisitiveness to know its contents. "Didn't I say he was a queer young man?" she exclaimed as she perused the missive attentively. "This is only his way of saying that he means to send you some flowers himself. But what puzzles me is to think how he could possibly know you were going to make any special toilette this evening. It is really very mysterious when I come to think of it. For Madame Didier said plainly that she would not ask Cellini to the dance till she saw him at the table d'hote tonight." "Perhaps Alphonse has told him all about it," I suggested. My friend's countenance brightened. "Of course that is it, and Mr. Cellini takes it for granted that a girl of your age would not be likely to refuse a dance. Still, there is something odd about it too. By the by, I forgot to ask you how the picture got on." "Oh, very well, I believe," I replied evasively. "Signor Cellini only made a slight outline sketch as a beginning." "And was it like you? A really good resemblance?" "I really didn't examine it closely enough to be able to judge." "What a demure young person you are!" laughed Mrs. Everard. "Now I should have rushed straight up to the easel and examined every line of what he was doing. You are a model of discretion, really. I shan't be anxious about leaving you alone any more. But about your dress for tonight. Let me see it. There's a good girl." I opened my trunk and took out a robe of ivory tinted crepe. It was made with almost severe simplicity, and was unadorned, save by a soft ruffle of old Mechlin lace around the neck and sleeves. Amy examined it critically. "Now you would have looked perfectly ghastly in this last night, when you were as pale and hollow eyed as a sick nun. But to night," and she raised her eyes to my face, "I believe you will do. Don't you want the bodice cut lower?" "No, thanks," I said, smiling. "I will leave that to the portly dowagers. They will expose neck enough for half a dozen women." My friend laughed. "Do as you like," she returned. "Only I see your gown has short sleeves, and I thought you might like a square neck instead of that little simple Greek round. But perhaps it's better as it is. The stuff is lovely. Where did you get it?" "At one of the London emporiums of Eastern art," I answered. "My dear, your tea is getting cold." She laid the dress on the bed, and in doing so perceived the antique looking book with the silver clasps which I had left there. "What's this?" she asked, turning it round to discover its name. "Letters of a Dead Musician! What a shivery title! Is it morbid reading?" "Not at all," I replied as I leaned comfortably back in an easy chair and sipped my tea. "It is a very scholarly, poetical, and picturesque work. Signor Cellini lent it to me. The author was a friend of his." Amy looked at me with a knowing and half serious expression. "Say now, take care, take care! Aren't you and Cellini getting to be rather particular friends? Something a little beyond the platonic, eh?" This notion struck me as so absurd that I laughed heartily. Then, without pausing for one instant to think what I was saying, I answered with amazing readiness and frankness, considering that I really knew nothing about it: "Why, my dear, Raffaello Cellini is betrothed, and he is a most devoted lover." A moment after I had uttered this assertion, I was surprised at myself. What authority had I for saying that Cellini was betrothed? What did I know about it? Confused, I endeavoured to find some means of retracting this unfounded and rash remark, but no words of explanation would come to my lips that had been so ready and primed to deliver what might be, for all I knew, a falsehood. Amy did not perceive my embarrassment. She was pleased and interested at the idea of Cellini's being in love. "Really," she exclaimed, "it makes him a more romantic character than ever. Fancy his telling you that he was betrothed! How delightful! I must ask him all about his chosen fair one. But I'm positively thankful it isn't you, for I'm sure he's just a little bit off his head. Even this book he has lent you looks like a wizard's property." And she fluttered the leaves of the Dead Musician's volume, turning them rapidly over in search of something attractive. Suddenly she paused and cried out, "Why, this is right down awful! He must have been a regular madman. Just listen!" And she read aloud: "How mighty are the kingdoms of the air! How vast they are! How densely populated! How glorious are their destinies! How all powerful and wise are their inhabitants! They possess everlasting health and beauty. Their movements are music. Their glances are light. They cannot err in their laws or judgment, for their existence is love. Thrones, principalities, and powers are among them, yet all are equal. Each one has a different duty to perform, yet all their labors are lofty. But what a fate is ours on this low earth! For from the cradle to the grave we are watched by these spiritual spectators, watched with unflinching interest, unhesitating regard. O angelic spirits, what is there in the poor and shabby spectacle of human life to attract your mighty intelligences? Sorrow, sin, pride, shame, ambition, failure, obstinacy, ignorance, selfishness, forgetfulness, enough to make ye veil your radiant faces in unperceivable clouds to hide forever the sight of so much crime and misery. Yet if there be the faintest, feeblest effort in our souls to answer to the call of your voices, to rise above the earth by force of the same will that pervades your destinies, how the sound of great rejoicing permeates those wide continents ye inhabit, like a wave of thunderous music, and ye are glad, blessed spirits, glad with a gladness beyond that of all your lives, to feel and to know that some vestige, however fragile, is spared from the general wreck of selfish and unbelieving humanity. Truly we work under the shadow of a cloud of witnesses. Disperse, disperse, O dense yet brilliant multitudes! Turn away from me your burning, truthful, immutable eyes, filled with that look of divine, perpetual regret and pity. Lo, how unworthy am I to behold your glory, and yet I must see and know and love you all, while the mad, blind world rushes on to its own destruction, and none can avert its doom." Here Amy threw down the book with a sort of contempt, and said to me, "If you're going to muddle your mind with the ravings of a lunatic, you are not what I took you for. Why, it's regular spiritualism. Kingdoms of the air, indeed! And his cloud of witnesses! Rubbish!" "He quotes the cloud of witnesses from St. Paul," I remarked. "More shame for him," replied my friend, with the usual inconsistent indignation that good Protestants invariably display when their pet corn, the Bible, is accidentally trodden on. "It has been very well said that the devil can quote Scripture, and this musician (a good job he is dead, I'm sure) is perfectly blasphemous to quote the Testament in support of his ridiculous ideas. St. Paul did not mean by a cloud of witnesses a lot of air multitudes, and burning immutable eyes, and all that nonsense." "Well, what did he mean?" I gently persisted. "Oh, he meant why, you know very well what he meant," said Amy, in a tone of reproachful solemnity. "And I wonder at your asking me such a question. Surely you know your Bible, and you must be aware that St. Paul could never have approved of spiritualism. 'And there are bodies celestial and bodies terrestrial, but one is the glory of the celestial,'" I quoted with a slight smile. Mrs. Everard looked shocked and almost angry. "My dear, I am ashamed of you. You are a believer in spirits, I do declare. Why, I thought Maskelyne and Cook had cured everybody of such notions, and now here's this horrid book going to make you more nervous than ever. I shall have you getting up one night and shrieking about burning, immutable eyes looking at you." I laughed merrily as I rose to pick up the discarded volume from the floor. "Don't be afraid," I said. "I'll give back the book to Signor Cellini to morrow, and I will tell him that you do not like the idea of my reading it, and that I am going to study the Bible instead. Come now, dear, don't look cross." And I embraced her warmly, for I liked her far too well to wish to offend her. "Let us concentrate our attention on our finery for tonight, when a dense and brilliant multitude, not of air but of the earthy, will pass us under critical survey. I assure you I mean to make the best of my improved looks, as I don't believe they will last. I dare say I shall be the sick nun that you termed me again to morrow." "I hope not, dearest," said my friend kindly, returning my caress and forgetting her momentary ill humour. "A jolly dance will do you good if you are careful to avoid over exertion. But you're quite right, we must really fix our things ready for the evening, else we shall be all in a flurry at the last moment, and nothing riles the Colonel so much as to see women in a fuss. I shall wear my lace dress, but it wants seeing to. Will you help me?" Readily assenting, we were soon deep in the arrangement of the numberless little mysteries that make up a woman's toilette, and nothing but the most frivolous conversation ensued. But as I assisted in the sorting of laces, jewels, and other dainty appendages of evening costume, I was deep in earnest meditation, reviewing in my own mind the various sensations I had experienced since I had tasted that Eastern wine in Cellini's studio. I came to the conclusion that he must have tried an experiment on me with some foreign drug of which he alone knew the properties. Why he should do this I could not determine, but that he had done it I was certain. Besides this, I felt sure that he personally exerted some influence upon me, a soothing and calming influence, I was forced to admit. Still it could hardly be allowed to continue. To be under the control, however slight, of one who was almost a stranger to me, was, at the least, unnatural and unpleasant. I was bound to ask him a few plain questions, and supposing Mrs. Everard were to speak to him about his being betrothed, and he were to deny it, and afterwards were to turn round upon me and ask what authority I had for making such a statement, what should I say? Convict myself of falsehood? However, it was no use to puzzle over the solution of this difficulty till it positively presented itself. At any rate, I determined I would ask him frankly, face to face, for some explanation of the strange emotions I had felt ever since meeting him; and thus resolved, I waited patiently for the evening. Chapter 4 Section 5 of A Romance of Two Worlds by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4 A Dance and a Promise. Our little French friend, Madame Didier, was not a woman to do things by half. She was one of those rare exceptions among Parisian ladies. She was a perfectly happy wife. Nay more, she was in love with her own husband, a fact which, considering the present state of society both in France and England, rendered her almost contemptible in the eyes of all advanced thinkers. She was plump and jolly in appearance, round-eyed and brisk as a lively robin. Her husband, a large, mild-faced, placid man, "mon petit mari," as she called him, permitted her to have her own way in everything, and considered all she did as perfectly well done. Therefore, when she had proposed this informal dance at the Hotel de L, he made no objection, but entered into her plans with spirit, and what was far more important, opened his purse readily to her demands for the necessary expenses. So nothing was stinted. The beautiful ballroom attached to the hotel was thrown open, and lavishly decorated with flowers, fountains, and twinkling lights. An awning extended from its windows right down the avenue of dark ilex trees, which were ornamented with Chinese lanterns. An elegant supper was laid out in the large dining room, and the whole establishment was en fête. The delicious strains of a Viennese band floated to our ears as Colonel Everard, his wife, and myself descended the staircase, on our way to the scene of revelry; and suggestions of fairyland were presented to us in the graceful girlish forms, clad in light, diaphanous attire, that flitted here and there or occasionally passed us. Colonel Everard marched proudly along with the military bearing that always distinguished him, now and then glancing admiringly at his wife, who indeed looked her very best. Her dress was of the finest Brussels lace, looped over a skirt of the palest shell pink satin. Deep crimson velvet roses clustered on her breast and nestled in her rich hair. A necklace of magnificent rubies clasped her neck, and the same jewels glittered on her round white arms. Her eyes shone with pleasurable excitement, and the prettiest colour imaginable tinted her delicate cheeks. "When an American woman is lovely, she is very lovely," I said. "You will be the belle of the room to night, Amy." "Nonsense," she replied, well pleased though at my remark. "You must remember I have a rival in yourself." I shrugged my shoulders incredulously. "It's not like you to be sarcastic," I said. "You know very well I have the air of a resuscitated corpse." The Colonel wheeled round suddenly and brought us all up to a standstill before a great mirror.
If you are like a resuscitated corpse, I'll throw $100 into the next mud pond," he observed. "Look at yourself." I looked, at first indifferently, and then with searching scrutiny. I saw a small, slender girl, clad in white, with a mass of gold hair twisted loosely up from her neck, and fastened with a single star of diamonds. A superb garniture of natural lilies of the valley was fastened on this girl's shoulder, and falling loosely across her breast, lost itself in the trailing folds of her gown. She held a palm leaf fan, entirely covered with lilies of the valley, and a girdle of the same flowers encircled her waist. Her face was serious but contented, her eyes were bright, but with an intense and thoughtful lustre, and her cheeks were softly coloured, as though a west wind had blown freshly against them. There was nothing either attractive or repulsive about her that I could see, and yet I turned away from the mirror hastily with a faint smile. "The lilies form the best part of my toilette," I said. "That they do," asserted Amy with emphasis. "They are the finest specimens I ever saw. It was real elegant of Mr. Cellini to send them all fixed up ready like that, fan and all. You must be a favourite of his." "Come, let us proceed," I answered with some abruptness. "We are losing time." In a few seconds more we entered the ballroom, and were met at once by Madame Didier, who, resplendent in black lace and diamonds, gave us hearty greeting. She stared at me with unaffected amazement. "Mon Dieu!" she exclaimed (her conversation with us was always a mixture of French and broken English), "I should not have known this young lady again. She have si bonne mine. You will dance, sans doute?" We readily assented, and the usual assortment of dancing men of all ages and sizes was brought forward for our inspection, while the Colonel, being introduced to a beaming English girl of some 17 summers, whirled her at once into the merry maze of dancers who were spinning easily round to the lively melody of one of Strauss's most fascinating waltzes. Presently I also found myself circling the room with an amiable young German, who ambled round with a certain amount of cleverness, considering that he was evidently ignorant of the actual waltz step, and I caught a glimpse now and then of Amy's rubies as they flashed past me in the dance. She was footing it merrily with a handsome Austrian hussar. The room was pleasantly full, not too crowded for the movements of the dancers, and the whole scene was exceedingly pretty and animated. I had no lack of partners, and I was surprised to find myself so keenly alive to enjoyment, and so completely free from my usual preoccupied condition of nervous misery. I looked everywhere for Raffaello Cellini, but he was not to be seen. The lilies that I wore, which he had sent me, seemed quite unaffected by the heat and glare of the gaslight. Not a leaf drooped, not a petal withered, and their remarkable whiteness and fragrance elicited many admiring remarks from those with whom I conversed. It was growing very late. There were only 2 more waltzes before the final cotillion. I was standing near the large open window of the ballroom, conversing with one of my recent partners, when a sudden inexplicable thrill shot through me from head to foot. Instinctively I turned and saw Cellini approaching. He looked remarkably handsome, though his face was pale and somewhat wearied in expression. He was laughing and conversing gaily with 2 ladies, one of whom was Mrs. Everard, and as he came towards me he bowed courteously, saying: "I am too much honoured by the kindness mademoiselle has shown in not discarding my poor flowers." "They are lovely," I replied simply, "and I am very much obliged to you, Signor, for sending them to me." "And how fresh they keep!" said Amy, burying her little nose in the fragrance of my fan. "Yet they have been in the heat of the room all the evening." "They cannot perish while mademoiselle wears them," said Cellini gallantly. "Her breath is their life." "Bravo!" cried Amy, clapping her hands. "That is very prettily said, isn't it?" I was silent. I never could endure compliments. They are seldom sincere, and it gives me no pleasure to be told lies, however prettily they may be worded. Signor Cellini appeared to divine my thoughts, for he said in a lower tone: "Pardon me, mademoiselle. I see my observation displeased you, but there is more truth in it than you perhaps know." "Oh, say!" interrupted Mrs. Everard at this juncture, "I am so interested, Signor, to hear you are engaged. I suppose she is a dream of beauty." The hot colour rushed to my cheeks, and I bit my lips in confusion and inquietude. What would he answer? My anxiety was not of long duration. Cellini smiled, and seemed in no way surprised. He said quietly: "Who told you, madame, that I am engaged?" "Why, she did, of course," went on my friend, nodding towards me, regardless of an imploring look I cast at her, "and said you were perfectly devoted." "She is quite right," replied Cellini, with another of those rare, sweet smiles of his; "and you are right, madame, in your supposition. My betrothed is a dream of beauty." I was infinitely relieved. I had not, then, been guilty of a falsehood. But the mystery remained. How had I discovered the truth of the matter at all? While I puzzled my mind over this question, the other lady who had accompanied Mrs. Everard spoke. She was an Austrian of brilliant position and attainments. "You quite interest me, Signor," she said. "Is your fair fiancée here to night?" "No, madame," replied Cellini, "she is not in this country." "What a pity!" exclaimed Amy. "I want to see her real bad, don't you?" she asked, turning to me. I raised my eyes and met the dark clear ones of the artist fixed full upon me. "Yes," I said hesitatingly, "I should like to meet her. Perhaps the chance will occur at some future time." "There is not the slightest doubt about that," said Cellini. "And now, mademoiselle, will you give me the pleasure of this waltz with you, or are you promised to another partner?" I was not engaged, and I at once accepted his proffered arm. Two gentlemen came hurriedly up to claim Amy and her Austrian friend, and for one brief moment Signor Cellini and I stood alone in a comparatively quiet corner of the ball room, waiting for the music to begin. I opened my lips to ask him a question, when he stopped me by a slight gesture of his hand. "Patience," he said in a low and earnest tone. "In a few moments you shall have the opportunity you seek." The band burst forth just then in the voluptuous strains of a waltz by Gungel, and together we floated away to its exquisite gliding measure. I use the word "floated" advisedly, for no other term could express the delightful sensation I enjoyed. Cellini was a superb dancer. It seemed to me that our feet scarcely touched the floor, so swiftly, so easily and lightly we sped along. A few rapid turns, and I noticed we were nearing the open French windows, and, before I well realized it, we had stopped dancing and were pacing quietly, side by side, down the ilex avenue, where the little lanterns twinkled like red fireflies and green glow worms among the dark and leafy branches. We walked along in silence till we reached the end of the path. There before us lay the open garden, with its broad green lawn bathed in the lovely light of the full moon, sailing aloft in a cloudless sky. The night was very warm, but regardless of this fact, Cellini wrapped carefully round me a large fleecy white burnous that he had taken from a chair where it was lying, on his way through the avenue. "I am not cold," I said, smiling. "No, but you will be, perhaps. It is not wise to run any useless risks." I was again silent. A low breeze rustled in the tree tops near us. The music of the ballroom reached us only in faint and far echoes. The scent of roses and myrtle was wafted delicately on the balmy air. The radiance of the moon softened the outlines of the landscape into a dreamy suggestiveness of its reality. Suddenly a sound broke on our ears, a delicious long plaintive trill, then a wonderful shower of sparkling roulades, and finally a clear imploring passionate note repeated many times. It was a nightingale singing as only the nightingales of the south can sing. I listened entranced. "Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard In ancient days by emperor and clown," quoted Cellini in earnest tones. "You admire Keats?" I asked eagerly. "More than any other poet that has lived," he replied. "His was the most ethereal and delicate muse that ever consented to be tied down to earth. But, mademoiselle, you do not wish to examine me as to my taste in poetry. You have some other questions to put to me, have you not?" For one instant I hesitated. Then I spoke out frankly, and answered: "Yes, Signor. What was there in that wine you gave me this morning?" He met my searching gaze unflinchingly. "A medicine," he said, "an excellent and perfectly simple remedy made of the juice of plants, and absolutely harmless." "But why?" I demanded. "Why did you give me this medicine? Was it not wrong to take so much responsibility upon yourself?" He smiled. "I think not. If you are injured or offended, then I was wrong. But if, on the contrary, your health and spirits are ever so little improved, as I see they are, I deserve your thanks, mademoiselle." And he waited with an air of satisfaction and expectancy. I was puzzled and half angry, yet I could not help acknowledging to myself that I felt better and more cheerful than I had done for many months. I looked up at the artist's dark, intelligent face, and said almost humbly: "I do thank you, Signor, but surely you will tell me your reasons for constituting yourself my physician without even asking my leave." He laughed, and his eyes looked very friendly. "Mademoiselle, I am one of those strangely constituted beings who cannot bear to see any innocent thing suffer. It matters not whether it be a worm in the dust or a butterfly in the air, a bird, a flower, or a human creature. The first time I saw you, I knew that your state of health precluded you from the enjoyment of life natural to your sex and age. I also perceived that the physicians had been at work upon you trying to probe into the causes of your ailment, and that they had signally failed. Physicians, mademoiselle, are very clever and estimable men, and there are a few things which come within the limit of their treatment. But there are also other things which baffle their utmost profundity of knowledge. One of these is that wondrous piece of human machinery, the nervous system. That intricate and delicate network of fine threads, electric wires, on which run the messages of thought, impulse, affection, emotion. If these threads or wires become, from any subtle cause, entangled, the skill of the mere medical practitioner is of no avail to undo the injurious knot, or to unravel the confused skein. The drugs generally used in such cases are, for the most part, repellent to the human blood and natural instinct. Therefore they are always dangerous, and often deadly. I knew by studying your face, mademoiselle, that you were suffering as acutely as I, too, suffered some 5 years ago, and I ventured to try upon you a simple vegetable essence, merely to see if you were capable of benefiting by it. The experiment has been so far successful, but—" He paused, and his face became graver and more abstracted. "But what?" I queried eagerly. "I was about to say," he continued, "that the effect is only transitory. Within 48 hours you must naturally relapse into your former prostrate condition, and I, unfortunately, am powerless to prevent it." I sighed wearily, and a feeling of disappointment oppressed me. Was it possible that I must again be the victim of miserable dejection, pain, and stupor? "You can give me another dose of your remedy," I said. "That I cannot, mademoiselle," he answered regretfully. "I dare not, without further advice and guidance." "Advice and guidance from whom?" I inquired. "From the friend who cured me of my long and almost hopeless illness," said Cellini. "He alone can tell me whether I am right in my theories respecting your nature and constitution." "And what are those theories?" I asked, becoming deeply interested in the conversation. Cellini was silent for a moment or so. He seemed absorbed in a sort of inward communion with himself. Then he spoke with impressiveness and gravity. "In this world, mademoiselle, there are no two natures alike, yet all are born with a small portion of divinity within them, which we call the soul. It is a mere spark smouldering in the centre of the weight of clay with which we are encumbered, yet it is there. Now this particular germ or seed can be cultivated, if we will; that is, if we desire and insist on its growth. As a child's taste for art or learning can be educated into high capabilities for the future, so can the human soul be educated into so high, so supreme an attainment, that no merely mortal standard of measurement can reach its magnificence. With much more than half the inhabitants of the globe, this germ of immortality remains always a germ, never sprouting, overlaid and weighted down by the lymphatic laziness and materialistic propensities of its shell or husk, the body. But I must put aside the forlorn prospect of the multitudes in whom the Divine Essence attains to no larger quantity than that proportioned out to a dog or bird. I have only to speak of the rare few with whom the soul is everything, those who, perceiving and admitting its existence within them, devote all their powers to fanning up their spark of light, till it becomes a radiant, burning, inextinguishable flame. The mistake made by these examples of beatified humanity is that they too often sacrifice the body to the demands of the spirit. It is difficult to find the medium path, but it can be found, and the claims of both body and soul can be satisfied without sacrificing the one to the other. I beg your earnest attention, mademoiselle, for what I say concerning the rare few with whom the soul is everything. You are one of those few, unless I am greatly in error, and you have sacrificed your body so utterly to your spirit that the flesh rebels and suffers. This will not do. You have work before you in the world, and you cannot perform it unless you have bodily health as well as spiritual desire. And why? Because you are a prisoner here on earth, and you must obey the laws of the prison, however unpleasant they may be to you. Were you free, as you have been in ages past, and as you will be in ages to come, things would be different. But at present you must comply with the orders of your jailers, the lords of life and death." I heard him, half awed, half fascinated. His words were full of mysterious suggestions. "How do you know I am of the temperament you describe?" I asked in a low voice. "I do not know, mademoiselle. I can only guess. There is but one person who can perhaps judge of you correctly, a man older than myself by many years, whose life is the very acme of spiritual perfection, whose learning is vast and unprejudiced. I must see and speak to him before I try any more of my, or rather his, remedies. But we have lingered long enough out here, and unless you have something more to say to me, we will return to the ballroom. You will otherwise miss the cotillion." And he turned to retrace the way through the illuminated grove. But a sudden thought had struck me, and I resolved to utter it aloud. Laying my hand on his arm and looking him full in the face, I said slowly and distinctly: "This friend of yours that you speak of, is not his name Heliobas?" Cellini started violently. The blood rushed up to his brows, and as quickly receded, leaving him paler than before. His dark eyes glowed with suppressed excitement. His hand trembled. Recovering himself slowly, he met my gaze fixedly. His glance softened, and he bent his head with an air of respect and reverence. "Mademoiselle, I see that you must know all. It is your fate. You are greatly to be envied. Come to me tomorrow, and I will tell you everything that is to be told. Afterwards your destiny rests in your own hands. Ask nothing more of me just now." He escorted me without further words back to the ballroom, where the merriment of the cotillion was then at its height. Whispering to Mrs. Everard as I passed her that I was tired and was going to bed, I reached the outside passage, and there, turning to Cellini, I said gently: "Good night, Signor. To-morrow at noon I will come." He replied: "Good night, mademoiselle. To-morrow at noon you will find me ready." With that he saluted me courteously and turned away. I hurried up to my own room, and on arriving there I could not help observing the remarkable freshness of the lilies I wore. They looked as if they had just been gathered. I unfastened them all from my dress and placed them carefully in water, then quickly disrobing, I was soon in bed. I meditated for a few minutes on the various odd occurrences of the day, but my thoughts soon grew misty and confused, and I travelled quickly off into the land of Nod, and thence into the region of sleep, where I remained undisturbed by so much as the shadow of a dream. Section 6 of A Romance of Two Worlds by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. Part 1. Cellini's Story. The following morning at the appointed hour I went to Cellini's studio, and was received by him with a sort of gentle courtesy and kindliness that became him very well. I was already beginning to experience an increasing languor and weariness, the sure forerunner of what the artist had prophesied, namely, a return of my old sufferings. Amy, tired out by the dancing of the previous night, was still in bed, as were many of those who had enjoyed Madame Didier's fete, and the hotel was unusually quiet, almost seeming as though half the visitors had departed during the night. It was a lovely morning, sunny and calm, and Cellini, observing that I looked listless and fatigued, placed a comfortable easy chair for me near the window, from whence I could see one of the prettiest parterres of the garden, gay with flowers of every colour and perfume. He himself remained standing, one hand resting lightly on his writing table, which was strewn with a confusion of letters and newspapers. "Where is Leo?" I asked, as I glanced around the room in search of that noble animal. "Leo left for Paris last night," replied Cellini. "He carried an important despatch for me, which I feared to trust to the post office." "Is it safer in Leo's charge?" I inquired, smiling, for the sagacity of the dog amused as well as interested me. "Much safer. Leo carries on his collar a small tin case, just large enough to contain several folded sheets of paper. When he knows he has that box to guard during his journeys, he is simply unapproachable. He would fight anyone who attempted to touch it with the ferocity of a hungry tiger, and there is no edible dainty yet invented that could tempt his appetite or coax him into any momentary oblivion of his duty. There is no more trustworthy or faithful messenger." "I suppose you've sent him to your friend, his master?" I said. "Yes, he has gone straight home to Heliobas." This name now awakened in me no surprise or even curiosity. It simply sounded homelike and familiar. I gazed abstractedly out of the window at the brilliant blossoms in the garden, that nodded their heads at me like so many little elves with coloured caps on, but I said nothing. I felt that Cellini watched me keenly and closely. Presently he continued: "Shall I tell you everything now, mademoiselle?" I turned towards him eagerly. "If you please," I answered. "May I ask you one question?" "Certainly." "How and when did you hear the name of Heliobas?" I looked up hesitatingly. "In a dream, Senor, strange to say, or rather in 3 dreams. I will relate them to you." And I described the visions I had seen, being careful to omit no detail, for indeed I remembered everything with curious distinctness. The artist listened with grave and fixed attention. When I had concluded, he said: "The elixir I gave you acted more potently than ever I imagined it would. You are more sensitive than I thought. Do not fatigue yourself any more, mademoiselle, by talking. With your permission I will sit down here opposite to you and tell you my story. Afterwards you must decide for yourself whether you will adopt the method of treatment to which I owe my life, and something more than my life, my reason." He turned his own library chair towards me and seated himself. A few moments passed in silence. His expression was very earnest and absorbed, and he regarded my face with a sympathetic interest which touched me profoundly. Though I felt myself becoming more and more enervated and apathetic as the time went on, and though I knew I was gradually sinking down again into my old slough of despond, yet I felt instinctively that I was somehow actively concerned in what was about to be said. Therefore I forced myself to attend closely to every word uttered. Cellini began to speak in low and quiet tones, as follows: "You must be aware, mademoiselle, that those who adopt any art as a means of livelihood begin the world heavily handicapped, weighed down, as it were, in the race for fortune. The following of art is a very different thing to the following of trade or mercantile business. In buying or selling, in undertaking the work of import or export, a good head for figures and an average quantity of shrewd common sense are all that is necessary in order to win a fair share of success. But in the finer occupations, whose results are found in sculpture, painting, music, and poetry, demands are made upon the imagination, the emotions, the entire spiritual susceptibility of man. The most delicate fibres of the brain are taxed, the subtle inner workings of thought are brought into active play, and the temperament becomes daily and hourly more finely strung, more sensitive, more keenly alive to every passing sensation. Of course, there are many so called artists who are mere shams of the real thing, persons who, having a little surface education in one or the other branch of the arts, play idly with the paint brush, or dabble carelessly in the deep waters of literature, or borrow a few crotchets and quavers from other composers, and putting them together in haste, call it original composition. Among these are to be found the self called professors of painting, the sculptors who allow the work of their ghosts to be admired as their own, the magazine scribblers, the smart young leader writers and critics, the half hearted performers on piano or violin who object to any innovation, and prefer to grind on in the unemotional, coldly correct manner which they are so pleased to term the classical. Such persons exist, and will exist, so long as good and evil are leading forces of life. They are the aphides of the rose of art, but the men and women I speak of as artists are those who work day and night to attain even a small degree of perfection, and who are never satisfied with their own best efforts. I was one of these some years ago, and I humbly assert myself to be of the same disposition. Only the difference between myself then and myself now is, that then I struggled blindly and despairingly, and now I labour patiently and with calmness, knowing positively that I shall obtain what I seek at the duly appointed hour. I was educated as a painter, mademoiselle, by my father, a good, simple hearted man, whose little landscapes looked like bits cut out of the actual field and woodland, so fresh and pure were they. But I was not content to follow in the plain path he first taught me to tread. Merely correct drawing, merely correct colouring, were not sufficient for my ambition. I had dazzled my eyes with the loveliness of Correggio's Madonna, and had marvelled at the wondrous blue of her robe, a blue so deep and intense that I used to think one might scrape away the paint till a hole was bored in the canvas, and yet not reach the end of that fathomless azure tint. I had studied the warm hues of Titian. I had felt ready to float away in the air with the marvellous Angel of the Annunciation, and with all these thoughts in me, how could I content myself with the ordinary aspiration of modern artists? I grew absorbed in one subject, colour. I noted how lifeless and pale the colouring of to day appeared beside that of the old masters, and I meditated deeply on the problem thus presented to me. What was the secret of Correggio, of Fra Angelico, of Raphael? I tried various experiments. I bought the most expensive and highly guaranteed pigments. In vain, for they were all adulterated by the dealers. Then I obtained colours in the rough, and ground and mixed them myself. Still, though a little better result was obtained, I found trade adulteration still at work with the oils, the varnishes, the mediums, in fact with everything that painters use to gain effect in their works. I could nowhere escape from vicious dealers, who, to gain a miserable percentage on every article sold, are content to be among the most dishonest in this dishonest age. I assure you, mademoiselle, that not one of the pictures which are now being painted for the salons of Paris and London can possibly last 100 years. I recently visited that palace of art, the South Kensington Museum in London, and saw there a large fresco by Sir Frederick Leighton. It had just been completed, I was informed. It was already fading. Within a few years it will be a blur of indistinct outlines. I compared its condition with the cartoons of Raphael and a superb Giorgione in the same building. These were as warm and bright as though recently painted. It is not Leighton's fault that his works are doomed to perish as completely off the canvas as though he had never traced them. It is his dire misfortune, and that of every other 19th century painter, thanks to the magnificent institution of free trade, which has resulted in a vulgar competition of all countries and all classes to see which can most quickly jostle the other out of existence. But I am wearying you, mademoiselle. Pardon me. To resume my own story. As I told you, I could think of nothing but the one subject of colour. It haunted me incessantly. I saw in my dreams visions of exquisite forms and faces that I longed to transfer to my canvas, but I could never succeed in the attempt. My hand seemed to have lost all skill. About this time my father died, and I, having no other relation in the world, and no ties of home to cling to, lived in utter solitude, and tortured my brain more and more with the one question that baffled and perplexed me. I became moody and irritable. I avoided intercourse with everyone, and at last sleep forsook my eyes. Then came a terrible season of feverish trouble, nervous dejection, and despair. At times I would sit silently brooding, at others I started up and walked rapidly for hours, in the hope to calm the wild unrest that took possession of my brain. I was then living in Rome, in the studio that had been my father's. One evening, how well I remember it, I was attacked by one of those fierce impulses that forbade me to rest or think or sleep, and, as usual, I hurried out for one of those long, aimless excursions I had latterly grown accustomed to. At the open street door stood the proprietress of the house, a stout, good natured contadina, with her youngest child Pippa holding to her skirt. As she saw me approaching, she started back with an exclamation of alarm, and catching the little girl up in her arms, she made the sign of the cross rapidly. Astonished at this, I paused in my hasty walk, and said with as much calmness as I could muster: "What do you mean by that? Have I the evil eye, think you?" Curly haired Pippa stretched out her arms to me. I had often caressed the little one, and given her sweetmeats and toys, but her mother held her back with a sort of smothered scream, and muttered: "Holy Virgin, Pippa must not touch him. He is mad." Mad! I looked at the woman and child in scornful amazement. Then, without further words, I turned and went swiftly away down the street, out of their sight. Mad! Was I indeed losing my reason? Was this the terrific meaning of my sleepless nights, my troubled thoughts, my strange inquietude? Fiercely I strode along, heedless whither I was going, till I found myself suddenly on the borders of the desolate Campagna. A young moon gleamed aloft, looking like a slender sickle thrust into the heavens to reap an overabundant harvest of stars. I paused irresolutely. There was a deep silence everywhere. I felt faint and giddy. Curious flashes of light danced past my eyes, and my limbs shook like those of a palsied old man. I sank upon a stone to rest, to try and arrange my scattered ideas into some sort of connection and order. Mad! I clasped my aching head between my hands and brooded on the fearful prospect looming before me. And in the words of poor King Lear, I prayed in my heart, "Oh, let me not be mad, not mad, sweet heavens!" Prayer! There was another thought. How could I pray? For I was a skeptic. My father had educated me with broadly materialistic views. He himself was a follower of Voltaire, and with his finite rod he took the measure of divinity, greatly to his own satisfaction. He was a good man too, and he died with exemplary calmness in the absolute certainty of there being nothing in his composition but dust, to which he was as bound to return. He had not a shred of belief in anything but what he called the universal law of necessity. Perhaps this was why all his pictures lacked inspiration. I accepted his theories without thinking much about them, and I had managed to live respectably without any religious belief. But now with the horrible phantom of madness rising before me, my firm nerves quailed. I longed to pray. Yet to whom? To what? To the universal law of necessity? In that there could be no hearing or answering of human petitions. I meditated on this with a kind of sombre ferocity. Who portioned out this law of necessity? What brutal code compels us to be born, to live, to suffer, and to die, without recompense or reason? Why should this universe be an ever circling wheel of torture? Then a fresh impetus came to me. I rose from my recumbent posture and stood erect. I trembled no more. A curious sensation of defiant amusement possessed me so violently that I laughed aloud. Such a laugh, too! I recoiled from the sound, as from a blow, with a shudder. It was the laugh of a madman! I thought no more. I was resolved. I would fulfill the grim law of necessity to its letter. If necessity caused my birth, it also demanded my death. Necessity could not force me to live against my will. Better eternal nothingness than madness. Slowly and deliberately I took from my vest a Milanese dagger of thin, sharp steel, one that I had always carried with me as a means of self defence. I drew it from its sheath and looked at the fine edge glittering coldly in the pallid moon rays. I kissed it joyously. It was my final remedy. I poised it aloft with firm fingers. Another instant and it would have been buried deep in my heart, when I felt a powerful grasp on my wrist, and a strong arm struggling with mine forced the dagger from my hand. Savagely angry at being thus foiled in my desperate intent, I staggered back a few paces and sullenly stared at my rescuer. He was a tall man, clad in a dark overcoat bordered with fur. He looked like a wealthy Englishman or American travelling for pleasure. His features were fine and commanding. His eyes gleamed with a gentle disdain as he coolly met my resentful gaze. When he spoke his voice was rich and mellifluous, though his accents had a touch in them of grave scorn. "So you're tired of your life, young man? All the more reason have you to live. Anyone can die. A murderer has moral force enough to jeer at his hangman. It is very easy to draw the last breath. It can be accomplished successfully by a child or a warrior. One pang of far less anguish than the toothache, and all is over. There's nothing heroic about it, I assure you. It is as common as going to bed. It is almost prosy. Life is heroism, if you like, but death is a mere cessation of business. And to make a rapid and rude exit off the stage before the prompter gives the sign is always, to say the least of it, ungraceful. Act the part out, no matter how bad the play. What say you?" And balancing the dagger lightly on one finger as though it were a paper knife, he smiled at me with so much frank kindliness that it was impossible to resist him. I advanced and held out my hand. "Whoever you are," I said, "you speak like a true man, but you are ignorant of the causes which compelled me to—" and a hard sob choked my utterance. My new acquaintance pressed my proffered hand cordially, but the gravity of his tone did not vary as he replied: "There is no cause, my friend, which compels us to take violent leave of existence, unless it be madness or cowardice." "Aye, and what if it were madness?" I asked eagerly. He scanned me attentively, and laying his fingers lightly on my wrist, felt my pulse. "Pooh, my dear sir," he said, "you are no more mad than I am. You are a little overwrought and excited, that I admit. You have some mental worry that consumes you. You shall tell me all about it. I have no doubt I can cure you in a few days." "Cure me?" I looked at him in wonderment and doubt. "Are you a physician?" I asked. He laughed. "Not I. I should be sorry to belong to the profession. Yet I administer medicines and give advice in certain cases. I am simply a remedial agent, not a doctor. But why do we stand here in this bleak place, which must be peopled by the ghosts of olden heroes? Come with me, will you? I am going to the Hotel Costanza, and we can talk there. As for this pretty toy, permit me to return it to you. You will not force it again to the unpleasant task of dispatching its owner." And he handed the dagger back to me with a slight bow. I sheathed it at once, feeling somewhat like a chidden child as I met the slightly satirical gleam of the clear blue eyes that watched me.
End of section 6. Section 7 of A Romance of Two Worlds by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5, Part 2. Cellini's Story.
"Will you give me your name, signor?" I asked, as we turned from the Campagna towards the city.
With pleasure. I am called Heliobas.
"A strange name?"
Oh, not at all. It is pure Chaldee.
My mother, as lovely as an Eastern houri, as Murillo's Madonna, and as devout as Saint Teresa, gave me the Christian saint's name of Casimir also. But Heliobas, pure et simple, suits me best, and by it I am generally known." "You are a Chaldean?" I inquired. "Exactly so. I am descended directly from one of those wise men of the East. And, by the way, there were more than three, and they were not all kings, who being wide awake happened to notice the birth star of Christ on the horizon before the rest of the world's inhabitants had so much as rubbed their sleepy eyes. The Chaldeans have been always quick of observation from time immemorial. But in return for my name, you will favour me with yours?" I gave it readily, and we walked on together. I felt wonderfully calmed and cheered, as soothed, mademoiselle, as I have noticed you yourself have felt when in my company."
Here Cellini paused and looked at me as though expecting a question, but I preferred to remain silent till I had heard all he had to say. He therefore resumed:
"We reached the Hotel Costanza, where Heliobas was evidently well known. The waiters addressed him as Monsieur le Comte, but he gave me no information as to this title. He had a superb suite of rooms in the hotel, furnished with every modern luxury, and as soon as we entered a light supper was served. He invited me to partake, and within the space of half an hour I had told him all my history, my ambition, my strivings after the perfection of colour, my disappointment, dejection, and despair, and finally the fearful dread of coming madness that had driven me to attempt my own life. He listened patiently and with unbroken attention. When I had finished, he laid one hand on my shoulder and said gently: "Young man, pardon me if I say that up to the present your career has been an inactive, useless, selfish kicking against the pricks, as St. Paul says. You set before yourself a task of noble effort, namely, to discover the secret of colouring as known to the old masters; and because you meet with the petty difficulty of modern trade adulteration in your materials, you think there is no chance, that all is lost. Fie! Do you think Nature is overcome by a few dishonest traders? She can still give you in abundance the unspoilt colours she gave to Raphael and Titian, but not in haste, not if you vulgarly scramble for her gifts in a mood that is impatient of obstacle and delay. Ohne Hast, ohne Rast is the motto of the stars. Learn it well. You have injured your bodily health by useful fretfulness and peevish discontent, and with that we have first to deal. In a week's time I will make a sound, sane man of you, and when I teach you how to get the colours you seek, yes," he added, smiling, "even to the compassing of Correggio's blue." I could not speak for joy and gratitude. I grasped my friend and preserver by the hand. We stood thus together for a brief interval, when suddenly Heliobas drew himself up to the full stateliness of his height, and bent his calm eyes deliberately upon me. A strange thrill ran through me. I still held his hand. "Rest," he said in slow and emphatic tones. "Weary and overwrought frame, take thy full and needful measure of repose. Struggling and deeply injured spirit, be free of thy narrow prison. By that force which I acknowledge within me and thee and in all created things, I command thee, rest." Fascinated, awed, overcome by his manner, I gazed at him and would have spoken, but my tongue refused its office, my senses swam, my eyes closed, my limbs gave way, I fell senseless. Cellini again paused and looked at me, intent on his words, I would not interrupt him. He went on: "When I say senseless, mademoiselle, I allude of course to my body. But I, myself, that is my soul, was conscious. I lived, I moved, I heard, I saw. Of that experience I am forbidden to speak. When I returned to mortal existence, I found myself lying on a couch in the same room where I had supped with Heliobas, and Heliobas himself sat near me reading. It was broad noonday. A delicious sense of tranquillity and youthful buoyancy was upon me, and without speaking I sprang up from my recumbent position and touched him on the arm. He looked up. "Well?" he asked, and his eyes smiled. I seized his hand and pressed it reverently to my lips. "My best friend!" I exclaimed. "What wonders have I not seen! What truths have I not learned! What mysteries!" "On all these things be silent," replied Heliobas. "They must not be lightly spoken of. And of the questions you naturally desire to ask me, you shall have the answers in due time. What has happened to you is not wonderful. You have simply been acted upon by scientific means. But your cure is not yet complete. A few days more passed with me will restore you thoroughly. Will you consent to remain so long in my company?" Gladly and gratefully I consented, and we spent the next 10 days together, during which Heliobas administered to me certain remedies, external and internal, which had a marvellous effect in renovating and invigorating my system. By the expiration of that time I was strong and well, a sound and sane man, as my rescuer had promised I should be. My brain was fresh and eager for work, and my mind was filled with new and grand ideas of art. And I had gained through Heliobas two inestimable things: a full comprehension of the truth of religion, and the secret of human destiny; and I had won a love so exquisite. Here Cellini paused, and his eyes were uplifted in a sort of wondering rapture. He continued after a pause: "Yes, mademoiselle, I discovered that I was loved and watched over and guided by one so divinely beautiful, so gloriously faithful, that mortal language fails before the description of such perfection." He paused again, and again continued: "When he found me perfectly healthy again in mind and body, Heliobas showed me his art of mixing colours. From that hour all my works were successful. You know that my pictures are eagerly purchased as soon as completed, and that the colour I obtain in them is to the world a mystery almost magical. Yet there is not one among the humblest of artists who could not, if he chose, make use of the same means as I have done to gain the nearly imperishable hues that still glow on the canvases of Raphael. But of this there is no need to speak just now. I have told you my story, mademoiselle, and it now rests with me to apply its meaning to yourself. You are attending?" "Perfectly," I replied; and indeed my interest at this point was so strong that I could almost hear the expectant beating of my heart. Cellini resumed: "Electricity, mademoiselle, is, as you are aware, the wonder of our age. No end can be foreseen to the marvels it is capable of accomplishing. But one of the most important branches of this great science is ignorantly derided just now by the larger portion of society. I mean the use of human electricity, that force which is in each one of us, in you and in me, and to a very large extent in Heliobas. He has cultivated the electricity in his own system to such an extent that his mere touch, his lightest glance, have healing in them, or the reverse, as he chooses to exert his power. I may say it is never the reverse, for he is full of kindness, sympathy, and pity for all humanity. His influence is so great that he can, without speaking, by his mere presence, suggest his own thoughts to other people who are perfect strangers, and cause them to design and carry out certain actions in accordance with his plans. You are incredulous? Mademoiselle, the power is in every one of us, only we do not cultivate it because our education is yet so imperfect. To prove the truth of what I say, I Though I have only advanced a little way in the cultivation of my own electric force, even I have influenced you. You cannot deny it. By my thought impelled to you, you saw clearly my picture that was actually veiled. By my force you replied correctly to a question I asked you concerning that same picture. By my desire you gave me, without being aware of it, a message from one I love when you said 'De Vouga,' you remember? And the elixir I gave you, which is one of the simplest remedies discovered by Heliobas, had the effect of making you learn what he intended you to learn, his name."
He! I exclaimed. "Why, he does not know me! He can have no intentions towards me!"
"Mademoiselle," replied Cellini gravely, "if you will think again of the last of your three dreams, you will not doubt that he has intentions towards you. As I told you, he is a physical electrician. By that is meant a great deal. He knows by instinct whether he is or will be needed sooner or later. Let me finish what I have to say. You are ill, mademoiselle, ill from overwork. You are an improvisatrice. That is, you have the emotional genius of music, a spiritual thing unfettered by rules and utterly misunderstood by the world. You cultivate this faculty, regardless of cost. You suffer, and you will suffer more. In proportion as your powers in music grow, so will your health decline. Go to Heliobas. He will do for you what he did for me. Surely you will not hesitate. Between years of weak invalidism and perfect health, in less than a fortnight, there can be no question of choice." I rose from my seat slowly. "Where is Heliobas?" I asked. "In Paris?" "Yes, in Paris. If you decide to go there, take my advice, and go alone. You can easily make some excuse to your friends. I will give you the address of a lady's pension, where you will be made at home and comfortable. May I do this?" "If you please," I answered. He wrote rapidly in pencil on a card of his own, "Madame Denise, 36 Avenue du Midi, Paris," and handed it to me. I stood still where I had risen, thinking deeply. I had been impressed and somewhat startled by Cellini's story, but I was in no way alarmed at the idea of trusting myself to the hands of a physical electrician, such as Heliobas professed to be. I knew that there were many cases of serious illness being cured by means of electricity, that electric baths and electric appliances of all descriptions were in ordinary use, and I saw no reason to be surprised at the fact of a man being in existence who had cultivated electric force within himself to such an extent that he was able to use it as a healing power. There seemed to me to be really nothing extraordinary in it. The only part of Cellini's narration I did not credit was the soul transmigration he professed to have experienced, and I put that down to the over excitement of his imagination at the time of his first interview with Heliobas. But I kept this thought to myself. In any case, I resolved to go to Paris. The great desire of my life was to be in perfect health, and I determined to omit no means of obtaining this inestimable blessing. Cellini watched me as I remained standing before him in silent abstraction. "Will you go?" he inquired at last. "Yes, I will go," I replied. "But will you give me a letter to your friend?" "Leo has taken it and all necessary explanations already," said Cellini, smiling. "I knew you would go. Heliobas expects you the day after to morrow. His residence is Hotel Mars, Champs Elysees. You are not angry with me, mademoiselle? I could not help knowing that you would go." I smiled faintly. "Electricity again, I suppose. No, I am not angry. Why should I be? I thank you very much, Signor, and I thank you more if Heliobas indeed effects my cure." "Oh, that is certain, positively certain," answered Cellini. "You can indulge that hope as much as you like, mademoiselle, for it is one that cannot be disappointed. Before you leave me, you will look at your own picture, will you not?" And advancing to his easel, he uncovered it.
I was greatly surprised. I thought he had but traced the outline of my features, whereas the head was almost completed. I looked at it as I would look at the portrait of a stranger. It was a wistful, sad-eyed, plaintive face, and on the pale gold of the hair rested a coronal of lilies.
"It will soon be finished," said Cellini, covering the easel again. "I shall not need another sitting, which is fortunate, as it is so necessary for you to go away. And now will you look at the life and death once more?"
I raised my eyes to the grand picture, unveiled that day in all its beauty.
"The face of the life angel there,"
went on Cellini quietly,
"is a poor and feeble resemblance of the one I love. You knew I was betrothed, mademoiselle?"
I felt confused, and was endeavouring to find an answer to this, when he continued:
"Do not trouble to explain, for I know how you knew. But no more of this. Will you leave Cannes to morrow?"
"Yes, in the morning."
"Then good bye, mademoiselle. Should I never see you again—"
"Never see me again?" I interrupted. "Why, what do you mean?"
"I do not allude to your destinies, but to mine," he said with a kindly look. "My business may call me away from here before you come back. Our paths may lie apart. Many circumstances may occur to prevent our meeting. So that, I repeat, should I never see you again, you will, I hope, bear me in your friendly remembrance as one who is sorry to see you suffer, and who was the humble means of guiding you to renewed health and happiness."
I held up my hand, and my eyes filled with tears. There was something so gentle and chivalrous about him, and withal so warm and sympathetic, that I felt indeed as if I were bidding adieu to one of the truest friends I should ever have in my life. "I hope nothing will cause you to leave Cannes till I return to it," I said with real earnestness. "I should like you to judge of my restoration to health."
"There will be no need for that," he replied. "I shall know when you are quite recovered through Heliobas."
He pressed my hand warmly. "I brought back the book you lent me," I went on, "but I should like a copy of it for myself. Can I get it anywhere?"
"Heliobas will give you one with pleasure," replied Cellini. "You have only to make the request. The book is not on sale; it was printed for private circulation only. And now, mademoiselle, we part. I congratulate you on the comfort and joy awaiting you in Paris. Do not forget the address: Hotel Mars, Champs Elysees. Farewell."
And again shaking my hand cordially, he stood at his door watching me as I passed out and began to ascend the stairs leading to my room. On the landing I paused, and looking round saw him still there. I smiled and waved my hand. He did the same in response, once, twice, then turning abruptly disappeared. That afternoon I explained to Colonel and Mrs. Everard that I had resolved to consult a celebrated physician in Paris, whose name, however, I did not mention, and should go there alone for a few days. On hearing that I knew of a well recommended ladies' pension, they made no objection to my arrangements, and they agreed to remain at the Hotel de L till I returned. I gave them no details of my plans, and of course never mentioned Raffaello Cellini in connection with the matter. A nervous and wretchedly agitated night made me more than ever determined to try the means of cure proposed to me. At 10 o'clock the following morning I left Cannes by express train for Paris. Just before starting I noticed that the lilies of the valley Cellini had given me for the dance had, in spite of my care, entirely withered, and were already black with decay, so black that they looked as though they had been scorched by a flash of lightning. Section 8 of A Romance of Two Worlds by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6, Part 1. The Hotel Mars and its Owner. It was between 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the day succeeding the night of my arrival in Paris, when I found myself standing at the door of the Hotel Mars, Champs Elysees. I had proved the pension kept by Madame Denise to be everything that could be desired, and on my presentation of Raffaello Cellini's card of introduction, I had been welcomed by the maitresse de la maison with a cordial effusiveness that amounted almost to enthusiasm. "C'est cher, Cellini!" the cheery and pleasant little woman had exclaimed, as she set before me a deliciously prepared breakfast. "Je l'aime tant! Il a si bon cœur, et ces beaux yeux! Mon Dieu, comme un ange!" As soon as I had settled the various little details respecting my room and attendants, and had changed my travelling dress for a quiet little toilette, I started for the abode of Heliobas. The weather was very cold. I had left the summer behind me at Cannes, to find the winter reigning supreme in Paris. A bitter east wind blew, and a few flakes of snow fell now and then from the frowning sky. The house to which I betook myself was situated at a commanding corner of a road facing the Champs Elysees. It was a noble looking building. The broad steps leading to the entrance were guarded on either side by a sculptured sphinx, each of whom held, in its massive stone paws, a plain shield, inscribed with the old Roman greeting to strangers, "Salve." Over the portico was designed a scroll which bore the name "Hotel Mars" in clearly cut capitals, and the monogram "C.H." I ascended the steps with some hesitation, and twice I extended my hand towards the bell, desiring yet fearing to awaken its summons. I noticed it was an electric bell, not needing to be pulled but pressed, and at last, after many doubts and anxious suppositions, I very gently laid my fingers on the little button which formed its handle. Scarcely had I done this than the great door slid open rapidly without the least noise. I looked for the servant in attendance. There was none. I paused an instant. The door remained invitingly open, and through it I caught a glimpse of flowers. Resolving to be bold and to hesitate no longer, I entered. As I crossed the threshold, the door closed behind me instantly with its previous swiftness and silence. I found myself in a spacious hall, light and lofty, surrounded with fluted pillars of white marble. In the centre a fountain bubbled melodiously, and tossed up every now and then a high jet of sparkling spray, while round its basin grew the rarest ferns and exotics, which emitted a subtle and delicate perfume. No cold air penetrated here; it was as warm and balmy as a spring day in southern Italy. Light Indian bamboo chairs, provided with luxurious velvet cushions, were placed in various corners between the marble columns, and on one of these I seated myself to rest a minute, wondering what I should do next, and whether any one would come to ask me the cause of my intrusion. My meditations were soon put to flight by the appearance of a young lad, who crossed the hall from the left hand side and approached me. He was a handsome boy of 12 or 13 years of age, and he was attired in a simple Greek costume of white linen, relieved with a broad crimson silk sash. A small flat crimson cap rested on his thick black curls. This he lifted with deferential grace, and saluting me, said respectfully: "My master is ready to receive you, mademoiselle." I rose without a word and followed him, scarcely permitting myself to speculate as to how his master knew I was there at all. The hall was soon traversed, and the lad paused before a magnificent curtain of deep crimson velvet, heavily bordered with gold. Pulling a twisted cord that hung beside it, the heavy regal folds parted in twain with noiseless regularity, and displayed an octagon room, so exquisitely designed and ornamented that I gazed upon it as upon some rare and beautiful picture. It was unoccupied, and my young escort placed a chair for me near the central window, informing me as he did so that Monsieur le Comte would be with me instantly, whereupon he departed. Left alone, I gazed in bewilderment at the loveliness round me. The walls and ceiling were painted in fresco. I could not make out the subjects, but I could see faces of surpassing beauty smiling from clouds, and peering between stars and crescents. The furniture appeared to be of very ancient Arabian design. Each chair was a perfect masterpiece of wood carving, picked out and inlaid with gold. The sight of a semi grand piano which stood open brought me back to the realization that I was living in modern times, and not in a dream of the Arabian Nights. While the Paris Figaro and the London Times, both of that day's issue, lying on a side table, demonstrated the 19th century to me with every possible clearness. There were flowers everywhere in this apartment, in graceful vases and in gilded osier baskets, and a queer lopsided Oriental jar stood quite near me, filled almost to overflowing with Neapolitan violets. Yet it was winter in Paris, and flowers were rare and costly. Looking about me, I perceived an excellent cabinet photograph of Raffaello Cellini, framed in antique silver, and I rose to examine it more closely, as being the face of a friend. While I looked at it, I heard the sound of an organ in the distance playing softly an old familiar church chant. I listened. Suddenly I bethought myself of the 3 dreams that had visited me, and a kind of nervous dread came upon me. This Heliobas, was I right after all in coming to consult him? Was he not perhaps a mere charlatan? And might not his experiments upon me prove fruitless, and possibly fatal? An idea seized me that I would escape while there was yet time. Yes, I would not see him to day at any rate. I would write and explain. These and other disjointed thoughts crossed my mind, and yielding to the unreasoning impulse of fear that possessed me, I actually turned to leave the room, when I saw the crimson velvet portiere dividing again its regular and graceful folds, and Heliobas himself entered. I stood mute and motionless. I knew him well. He was the very man I had seen in my 3rd and last dream. The same noble, calm features, the same commanding presence, the same keen, clear eyes, the same compelling smile. There was nothing extraordinary about his appearance, except his stately bearing and handsome countenance. His dress was that of any well to do gentleman of the present day, and there was no affectation of mystery in his manner. He advanced and bowed courteously, then with a friendly look held out his hand. I gave him mine at once. "So you are the young musician," he said in those warm, mellifluous accents that I had heard before, and that I so well remembered. "My friend Raffaello Cellini has written to me about you. I hear you have been suffering from physical depression." He spoke as any physician might do who inquired after a patient's health. I was surprised and relieved. I had prepared myself for something darkly mystical, almost cabalistic, but there was nothing unusual in the demeanour of this pleasant and good-looking gentleman, who, bidding me be seated, took a chair himself opposite to me, and observed me with that sympathetic and kindly interest which any well-bred doctor would esteem it his duty to exhibit. I became quite at ease, and answered all his questions fully and frankly. He felt my pulse in the customary way, and studied my face attentively. I described all my symptoms, and he listened with the utmost patience. When I had concluded, he leaned back in his chair and appeared to ponder deeply for some moments. Then he spoke. "You know, of course, that I am not a doctor." "I know," I said. "Signor Cellini explained it to me." "Ah!" and Heliobas smiled. "Raffaello explained as much as he might, but not everything. I must tell you I have a simple pharmacopoeia of my own. It contains 12 remedies, and only 12. In fact, there are no more that are of any use to the human mechanism. All are made of the juice of plants, and 6 of them are electric. Raffaello tried you with one of them, did he not?" As he put this question, I was aware of a keenly inquiring look sent from the eyes of my interrogator into mine. "Yes," I answered frankly, "and it made me dream, and I dreamt of you." Heliobas laughed lightly. "So that is well. Now I am going in the first place to give you what I am sure will be satisfactory information. If you agree to trust yourself to my care, you will be in perfect health in a little less than a fortnight. But you must follow my rules exactly." I started from my seat. "Of course!" I exclaimed eagerly, forgetting all my previous fear of him. "I will do all you advise, even if you wish to magnetize me as you magnetized Signor Cellini."
"I never magnetized Raffaello," he said gravely. "He was on the verge of madness, and he had no faith whereby to save himself. I simply set him free for a time, knowing that his was a genius which would find things for itself, or perish in the effort. I let him go on a voyage of discovery, and he came back perfectly satisfied. That is all. You do not need his experience." "How do you know?" I asked. "You are a woman. Your desire is to be well and strong, health being beauty; to love and to be beloved; to wear pretty toilettes and to be admired; and you have a creed which satisfies you, and which you believe in without proofs." There was the slightest possible tinge of mockery in his voice as he said these words. A tumultuous rush of feelings overcame me. My high dreams of ambition, my innate scorn of the trite and commonplace, my deep love of art, my desires of fame, all these things bore down upon my heart and overcame it, and a pride too deep for tears arose in me and found utterance. "You think I am so slight and weak a thing!" I exclaimed. "You, who profess to understand the secrets of electricity, you have no better instinctive knowledge of me than that? Do you deem women all alike, all on one common level, fit for nothing but to be the toys or drudges of men? Can you not realize that there are some among them who despise the inanities of everyday life, who care nothing for the routine of society, and whose hearts are filled with cravings that no mere human love or life can satisfy? Yes, even weak women are capable of greatness, and if we do sometimes dream of what we cannot accomplish, through lack of the physical force necessary for large achievements, that is not our fault, but our misfortune. We did not create ourselves. We did not ask to be born with the over sensitiveness, the fatal delicacy, the highly strung nervousness of the feminine nature. Monsieur Heliobas, you are a learned and far seeing man, I have no doubt. But you do not read me aright if you judge me as a mere woman who is perfectly contented with the petty commonplaces of ordinary living. And as for my creed, what is it to you whether I kneel in the silence of my own room, or in the glory of a lighted cathedral, to pour out my very soul to One whom I know exists, and whom I am satisfied to believe in, as you say, without proofs, save such proofs as I obtain from my own inner consciousness? I tell you, though in your opinion it is evident my sex is against me, I would rather die than sink into the miserable nonentity of such lives as are lived by the majority of women." I paused, overcome by my own feelings. Heliobas smiled. "So you are stung," he said quietly, "stung into action. That is as it should be. Resume your seat, mademoiselle, and do not be angry with me. I am studying you for your own good. In the meantime, permit me to analyze your words a little. You are young and inexperienced. You speak of the over sensitiveness, the fatal delicacy, the highly strung nervousness of the feminine nature. My dear lady, if you had lived as long as I have, you would know that these are mere stock phrases, for the most part meaningless. As a rule, women are less sensitive than men. There are many of your sex who are nothing but lumps of lymph and fatty matter, women with less instinct than the dumb beasts, and with more brutality. There are others who, adding the low cunning of the monkey to the vanity of the peacock, seek no other object but the furtherance of their own designs, which are always petty even when not absolutely mean. There are obese women whose existence is a doze between dinner and tea. There are women with thin lips and pointed noses, who only live to squabble over domestic grievances and interfere in their neighbours' business. There are your murderous women with large almond eyes, fair white hands, and voluptuous red lips, who, deprived of the dagger or the poison bowl, will slay a reputation in a few lazily enunciated words, delivered with a perfectly high bred accent. There are the miserly women who look upon cheese parings and candle ends and lock up the soap. There are the spiteful women whose very breath is acidity and venom. There are the frivolous women whose chitter chatter and senseless giggle are as empty as the rattling of dry peas on a drum. In fact, the delicacy of women is extremely overrated. their coarseness is never done full justice to. I have heard them recite in public selections of a kind that no man would dare to undertake, such as Tennyson's Rizpah, for instance. I know a woman who utters every line of it, with all its questionable allusions, boldly before any and everybody, without so much as an attempt at blushing. I assure you men are far more delicate than women, far more chivalrous, far larger in their views, and more generous in their sentiments. But I will not deny the existence of about 4 women in every 250 who may be, and possibly are, examples of what the female sex was originally intended to be: pure hearted, self denying, gentle and truthful, filled with tenderness and inspiration. Heaven knows my own mother was all this and more, and my sister is.
End of section 8. Section 9 of A Romance of Two Worlds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6, Part 2. The Hotel Mars and its Owner.
But let me speak to you of yourself. You love music, I understand. You are a professional artist?" "I was," I answered, "till my state of health stopped me from working." Heliobas bent his eyes upon me in friendly sympathy. "You were, and you will be again, an improvisatrice," he went on. "Do you not find it difficult to make your audiences understand your aims?" I smiled as the remembrance of some of my experiences in public came to my mind. "Yes," I said, half laughing. "In England, at least, people do not know what is meant by improvising. They think it is to take a little theme and compose variations on it, the mere ABC of the art. But to sit down to the piano and plan a whole sonata or symphony in your head, and play it while planning it, is a thing they do not and will not understand. They come to hear, and they wonder and go away, and the critics declare it to be claptrap." "Exactly," replied Heliobas. "But you are to be congratulated on having attained this verdict. Everything that people cannot quite understand is called claptrap in England, as for instance the matchless violin playing of Sarasate, the tempestuous splendor of Rubinstein, the wailing throb of passion in Holman's violoncello. This is, according to the London press, claptrap, while the coldly correct performances of Joachim and the icily null renderings of Charles Hall are voted magnificent and full of color. But to return to yourself. Will you play to me?" "I have not touched the instrument for 2 months," I said. "I am afraid I am out of practice." "Then you shall not exert yourself to day," returned Heliobas kindly. "But I believe I can help you with your improvisations. You compose the music as you play, you tell me. Well, have you any idea how the melodies or the harmonies form themselves in your brain?" "Not the least in the world," I replied. "Is the act of thinking them out an effort to you?" he asked. "Not at all. They come as though someone else were planning them for me." "Well, well, I think I can certainly be of use to you in this matter as in others. I understand your temperament thoroughly, and now let me give you my first prescription." He went to the corner of the room and lifted from the floor an ebony casket, curiously carved and ornamented with silver. This he unlocked. It contained 12 flasks of cut glass, stoppered with gold and numbered in order. He next pulled out a side drawer in this casket, and in it I saw several little thin empty glass tubes, about the size of a cigarette holder. Taking 2 of these, he filled them from the 2 of the larger flasks, corked them tightly, and then turning to me said: "To night, on going to bed, have a warm bath. Empty the contents of the tube marked No. 1 into it, and then immerse yourself thoroughly for about 5 minutes. After the bath, put the fluid in this other tube, marked 2, into a tumbler of fresh spring water, and drink it off. Then go straight to bed." "Shall I have any dreams?" I inquired, with a little anxiety. "Certainly not," replied Heliobas, smiling. "I wish you to sleep as soundly as a year old child. Dreams are not for you to night. Can you come to me tomorrow afternoon at 5 o'clock? If you can arrange to stay for dinner, my sister will be pleased to meet you, but perhaps you are otherwise engaged." I told him I was not, and explained where I had taken rooms, adding that I had come to Paris expressly to put myself under his treatment. "You shall have no cause to regret this journey," he said earnestly. "I can cure you thoroughly, and I will. I forget your nationality. You are not English?" "No, not entirely. I am half Italian." "Ah, yes, I remember now. But you have been educated in England?" "Partly." "I am glad it is only partly," remarked Heliobas. "If it had been entirely, your improvisations would have had no chance. In fact, you never would have improvised. You would have played the piano like poor mechanical Arabella Goddard. As it is, there is some hope of originality in you. You need not be one of the rank and file unless you choose." "I do not choose," I said. "Well, you must take the consequences, and they are bitter. A woman who does not go with her time is voted eccentric. A woman who prefers music to tea and scandal is an undesirable acquaintance. A woman who prefers Byron to Austin Dobson is, in fact, no measure can gauge her general impossibility." I laughed gaily. "I will take all the consequences as willingly as I will take your medicines," I said, stretching out my hand for the little vases which he gave me wrapped in paper. "And I thank you very much, monsieur. And" here I hesitated, "ought I not to ask him his fee? Surely the medicines ought to be paid for?" Heliobas appeared to read my thoughts, for he said, as though answering my unuttered question: "I do not accept fees, mademoiselle. To relieve your mind from any responsibility of gratitude to me, I will tell you at once that I never promise to effect a cure unless I see that the person who comes to be cured has a certain connection with myself. If the connection exists, I am bound by fixed laws to serve him or her. Of course I am able also to cure those who are not by nature connected with me, but then I have to establish a connection, and this takes time and is sometimes very difficult to accomplish, almost as tremendous a task as the laying down of the Atlantic cable. But in your case I am actually compelled to do my best for you, so you need be under no sense of obligation." Here was a strange speech, the first really inexplicable one I had heard from his lips. "I am connected with you?" I asked, surprised. "How? In what way?" "It would take too long to explain it to you just now," said Heliobas gently, "but I can prove to you in a moment that a connection does exist between your inner self and my inner self, if you wish it." "I do wish it very much," I answered. "Then take my hand," continued Heliobas, stretching it out, "and look steadily at me." I obeyed, half trembling. As I gazed, a veil appeared to fall from my eyes. A sense of security, of comfort, and of absolute confidence came upon me, and I saw what might be termed the image of another face looking at me through or behind the actual form and face of Heliobas. And that other face was his, and yet not his. But whatever it appeared to be, it was the face of a friend to me, one that I was certain I had known long, long ago, and moreover, one that I must have loved in some distant time, for my whole soul seemed to yearn towards that indistinct haze, where smiled the fully recognized yet unfamiliar countenance. This strange sensation lasted but a few seconds, for Heliobas suddenly dropped my hand. The room swam round me, the walls seemed to rock, then everything steadied and came right again, and all was as usual, only I was amazed and bewildered. "What does it mean?" I murmured. "It means the simplest thing in nature," replied Heliobas quietly, "namely, that your soul and mine are for some reason or other placed on the same circle of electricity. Nothing more nor less. Therefore we must serve each other. Whatever I do for you, you have it in your power to repay me amply for hereafter." I met the steady glance of his keen eyes, and a sense of some indestructible force within me gave me a sudden courage. "Decide for me as you please," I answered fearlessly. "I trust you completely. though I do not know why I do so. You will know before long. You are satisfied of the fact that my touch can influence you?" "Yes, most thoroughly." "Very well. All other explanations, if you desire them, shall be given you in due time. In the power I possess over you and some others, there is neither mesmerism nor magnetism, nothing but a purely scientific fact which can be clearly and reasonably proved and demonstrated. But till you are thoroughly restored to health, we will defer all discussion. And now, mademoiselle, permit me to escort you to the door. I shall expect you to morrow." Together we left the beautiful room in which this interview had taken place, and crossed the hall. As we approached the entrance, Heliobas turned towards me and said with a smile: "Did not the manoeuvres of my street door astonish you?" "A little," I confessed. "It is very simple. The button you touch outside is electric. It opens the door, and at the same time rings the bell in my study, thus informing me of a visitor. When the visitor steps across the threshold, he treads, whether he will or no, on another apparatus, which closes the door behind him, and rings another bell in my page's room, who immediately comes to me for orders. You see how easy? And from within it is managed in almost the same manner." And he touched a handle similar to the one outside, and the door opened instantly. Heliobas held out his hand, that hand which a few minutes previously had exercised such strange authority over me. "Good bye, mademoiselle. You are not afraid of me now?" I laughed. "I do not think I was ever really afraid of you," I said. "If I was, I am not so any longer. You have promised me health, and that promise is sufficient to give me entire courage." "That is well," said Heliobas. "Courage and hope in themselves are the precursors of physical and mental energy. Remember to morrow at 5, and do not keep late hours to night. I should advise you to be in bed by 10 at the latest." I agreed to this, and we shook hands and parted. I walked blithely along, back to the Avenue du Midi, where, on my arrival indoors, I found a letter from Mrs. Everard. She wrote in haste to give me the names of some friends of hers, whom she had discovered, through the American Register, to be staying at the Grand Hotel. She begged me to call upon them, and enclosed 2 letters of introduction for the purpose. She concluded her epistle by saying: "Raffaello Cellini has been invisible ever since your departure, but our inimitable waiter Alphonse says he is very busy finishing a picture for the Salon, something that we have never seen. I shall intrude myself into his studio soon on some pretence or other, and will then let you know all about it. In the meantime, believe me, your ever devoted friend, Amy." I answered this letter, and then spent a pleasant evening at the Pension, chatting sociably with Madame Denise and another cheery little Frenchwoman, a day governess, who boarded there, and who had no end of droll experiences to relate, her enviable temperament being to always see the humorous side of life. I thoroughly enjoyed her sparkling chatter and her expressive gesticulations, and we all 3 made ourselves merry till bedtime. Acting on the advice of Heliobas, I retired early to my room, where a warm bath had been prepared in compliance with my orders. I uncorked the glass tube No. 1, and poured the colourless fluid it contained into the water, which immediately bubbled gently, as though beginning to boil. After watching it for a minute or 2, and observing that this seething movement steadily continued, I undressed quickly and stepped in. Never shall I forget the exquisite sensation I experienced. I can only describe it as the poor little doll's dressmaker, and our mutual friend, described her angel visitants, her blessed children, who used to come and take her up and make her light. If my body had been composed of no grosser matter than fire and air, I could not have felt more weightless, more buoyant, more thoroughly exhilarated, than when, at the end of the prescribed 5 minutes, I got out of that marvellous bath of healing. As I prepared for bed, I noticed that the bubbling of the water had entirely ceased, but this was easy of comprehension, for if it had contained electricity, as I supposed, my body had absorbed it by contact, which would account for the movement being stilled. I now took the second little phial, and prepared it as I had been told. This time the fluid was motionless.
I noticed it was very faintly tinged with amber. I drank it off. It was perfectly tasteless. Once in bed, I seemed to have no power to think any more. My eyes closed readily. The slumber of a year-old child, as Heliobas had said, came upon me with resistless and sudden force, and I remembered no more. Section 10 of A Romance of Two Worlds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Amy Graymore. Chapter 7 Part 1 Zara and Prince Ivan. The sun poured brilliantly into my room when I awoke the next morning. I was free from all my customary aches and pains, and a delightful sense of vigour and elasticity pervaded my frame. I rose at once, and looking at my watch, found to my amazement that it was 12 o'clock in the day. Hastily throwing on my dressing gown, I rang the bell, and the servant appeared. "Is it actually midday?" I asked her. "Why did you not call me?" The girl smiled apologetically. "I did knock at mademoiselle's door, but she gave me no answer. Madame Denise came up also and entered the room, but seeing mademoiselle in so sound a sleep, she said it was a pity to disturb mademoiselle." Which statement good Madame Denise, toiling upstairs just then with difficulty, she being stout and short of breath, confirmed with many smiling nods of her head. "Breakfast shall be served at the instant," she said, rubbing her fat hands together. "But to disturb you when you slept, ah, Heaven! The sleep of an infant! I could not do it. I should have been wicked." I thanked her for her care of me. I could have kissed her, she looked so motherly and kind and altogether lovable. And I felt so merry and well. She and the servant retired to prepare my coffee, and I proceeded to make my toilette. As I brushed out my hair, I heard the sound of a violin. Someone was playing next door. I listened and recognized a famous Beethoven concerto. The unseen musician played brilliantly and withal tenderly, both touch and tone reminding me of some beautiful verses in a book of poems I had recently read, called Love Letters of a Violinist, in which the poet [Footnote: Author of the equally beautiful Idyll, Gladys the Singer, included in the new American copyright edition just issued.] talks of his love Amati, and says: "I prayed my prayer, I wove into my song Fervour and joy and mystery, and the bleak, The wan despair that words could never speak. I prayed as if my spirit did belong To some old master who was wise and strong, Because he loved and suffered and was weak. I trilled the notes and curbed them to a sigh, And when they faltered most I made them leap Fierce from my bow as from a summer sleep. A young she devil I was fired thereby To bolder efforts, and a muffled cry Came from the strings as if a saint did weep. I changed the theme, I dallied with the bow, Just time enough to fit it to a mesh Of merry tones, and drew it back afresh To talk of truth and constancy and woe, And life and love and madness, and the glow Of mine own soul which burns into my flesh. All my love for music welled freshly up in my heart. I, who had felt disinclined to touch the piano for months now, longed to try my strength again upon the familiar and responsive keyboard. For a piano has never been a mere piano to me. It is a friend who answers to my thought, and whose notes meet my fingers with caressing readiness and obedience. Breakfast came, and I took it with great relish. Then to pass the day I went out and called on Mrs. Everard's friends, Mr. and Mrs. Challoner, and their daughters. I found them very agreeable, with that easy bonhomie and lack of stiffness that distinguishes the best Americans. Finding out through Mrs. Everard's letters that I was an "artiste," they at once concluded I must need support and patronage, and with impulsive large heartedness were beginning to plan as to the best means of organizing a concert for me. I was taken by surprise at this, for I had generally found the exact reverse of this sympathy among English patrons of art, who were never tired of murmuring the usual platitudes about there being so many musicians. Music was overdone, improvising was not understood or cared for, etc., etc.
But these agreeable Americans, as soon as they discovered that I had not come for any professional reason to Paris, but only to consult a physician about my health, were actually disappointed. "Oh, we shall persuade you to give a recital some time," persisted the handsome, smiling mother of the family. "I know lots of people in Paris. We'll get it up for you." I protested, half laughing, that I had no idea of the kind, but they were incorrigibly generous. "Nonsense!" said Mrs. Challoner, arranging her diamond rings on her pretty white hand with pardonable pride. "Brains don't go for nothing in our country. As soon as you are fixed up in health, we'll give you a grand soiree in Paris, and we'll work up all our folks in the place. Don't tell me you are not as glad of dollars as any one of us." "Dollars are very good," I admitted, "but real appreciation is far better." "Well, you shall have both from us," said Mrs. Challoner. "And now will you stop to luncheon?" I accepted this invitation, given as it was with the most friendly affability, and enjoyed myself very much. "You don't look ill," said the eldest Miss Challoner to me later on. "I don't see that you want a physician." "Oh, I'm getting much better now," I replied, "and I hope soon to be quite well." "Who's your doctor?" I hesitated. Somehow the name of Heliobas would not come to my lips. Fortunately, Mrs. Challoner diverted her daughter's attention at this moment by the announcement that a dressmaker was waiting to see her; and in the face of such an important visit no one remembered to ask me again the name of my medical adviser. I left the Grand Hotel in good time to prepare for my second visit to Heliobas. As I was getting there to dinner I made a slightly dressy toilette, if a black silk robe relieved with a cluster of pale pink roses can be called dressy. This time I drove to the Hotel Mars, dismissing the coachman, however, before ascending the steps. The door opened and closed as usual, and the first person I saw in the hall was Heliobas himself, seated in one of the easy chairs, reading a volume of Plato. He rose and greeted me cordially. Before I could speak a word, he said: "You need not tell me that you slept well. I see it in your eyes and face. You feel better." My gratitude to him was so great that I found it difficult to express my thanks. Tears rushed to my eyes, yet I tried to smile, though I could not speak. He saw my emotion, and continued kindly: "I am as thankful as you can be for the cure which I see has begun, and will soon be effected. My sister is waiting to see you. Will you come to her room?" We ascended a flight of stairs thickly carpeted, and bordered on each side by tropical ferns and flowers, placed in exquisitely painted china pots and vases. I heard the distant singing of many birds mingled with the ripple and plash of waters. We reached a landing where the afterglow of the set sun streamed through a high oriel window of richly stained glass. Turning towards the left, Heliobas drew aside the folds of some azure satin hangings, and called in a low voice, "Zara!" motioned to me to enter. I stepped into a spacious and lofty apartment, where the light seemed to soften and merge into many shades of opaline radiance and delicacy; a room the beauty of which would at any other time have astonished and delighted me, but which now appeared as nothing beside the surpassing loveliness of the woman who occupied it. Never shall I behold again any face or form so divinely beautiful. She was about the medium height of woman, but her small finely shaped head was set upon so slender and proud a throat that she appeared taller than she actually was. Her figure was most exquisitely rounded and proportioned, and she came across the room to give me greeting with a sort of gliding, graceful movement, like that of a stately swan floating on calm sunlit water. Her complexion was transparently clear, most purely white, most delicately rosy. Her eyes, large, luminous, and dark as night, fringed with long silky black lashes, looked like fairy lakes where tender thoughts swam softly to and fro. Her rich black hair was arranged a la Marguerite, and hung down in one long loose thick braid that nearly reached the end of her dress, and she was attired in a robe of deep old gold Indian silk as soft as cashmere, which was gathered in round her waist by an antique belt of curious jewel work, in which rubies and turquoises seemed to be thickly studded. On her bosom shone a strange gem, the colour and form of which I could not determine. It was never the same for 2 minutes together. It glowed with many various hues, now bright crimson, now lightning blue, sometimes deepening into a rich purple or tawny orange. Its lustre was intense, almost dazzling to the eye. Its beautiful wearer gave me welcome with a radiant smile and a few cordial words, and drawing me by the hand to the low couch she had just vacated, made me sit down beside her. Heliobas had disappeared. "And so," said Zara, how soft and full of music was her voice, "so you are one of Casimir's patients. I cannot help considering that you are fortunate in this, for I know my brother's power. If he says he will cure you, you may be sure he means it. And you are already better, are you not?" "Much better," I said, looking earnestly into the lovely star like eyes that regarded me with such interest and friendliness. "Indeed, to day I have felt so well that I cannot realize ever having been ill." "I am very glad," said Zara. "I know you are a musician, and I think there can be no bitterer fate than for one belonging to your art to be incapacitated from performance of work by some physical obstacle. Poor grand old Beethoven! Can anything be more pitiful to think of than his deafness? Yet how splendidly he bore up against it! And Chopin, too, so delicate in health that he was too often morbid even in his music. Strength is needed to accomplish great things, the double strength of body and soul." "Are you too a musician?" I inquired. "No. I love music passionately, and I play a little on the organ in our private chapel, but I follow a different art altogether. I am a mere imitator of noble form. I am a sculptress." "You?" I said in some wonder, looking at the very small, beautifully formed white hand that lay passively on the edge of the couch beside me. "You make statues in marble like Michael Angelo?" "Like Angelo?" murmured Zara, and she lowered her brilliant eyes with a reverential gravity. "No one in these modern days can approach the immortal splendour of that great master. He must have known heroes and talked with gods to be able to hew out of the rocks such perfection of shape and attitude as his David. Alas! my strength in brain and hand is mere child's play compared to what has been done in sculpture, and what will yet be done. Still I love the work for its own sake, and I am always trying to render a resemblance of—" Here she broke off abruptly, and a deep blush suffused her cheeks. Then looking up suddenly, she took my hand impulsively and pressed it. "Be my friend," she said, with a caressing inflection in her rich voice. "I have no friends of my own sex, and I wish to love you. My brother has always had so much distrust of the companionship of women for me. You know his theories, and he has always asserted that the sphere of thought in which I have lived all my life is so widely apart from those in which other women exist, that nothing but unhappiness for me would come out of associating us together. When he told me yesterday that you were coming to see me today, I knew he must have discovered something in your nature that was not antipathetic to mine, otherwise he would not have brought you to me. Do you think you can like me? Perhaps love me after a little while?" It would have been a cold heart indeed that could not have responded to such a speech as this, uttered with the pleading prettiness of a loving child. Besides, I had warmed to her from the first moment I had touched her hand, and I was overjoyed to think that she was willing to elect me as a friend. I therefore replied to her words by putting my arm affectionately round her waist and kissing her. My beautiful tender Zara! How innocently happy she seemed to be thus embraced, and how gently her fragrant lips met mine in that sisterly caress! She leaned her dark head for a moment on my shoulder, and the mysterious jewel on her breast flashed in a weird red hue, like the light of a stormy sunset. "And now we have drawn up, signed, and sealed our compact of friendship," she said gaily. "Will you come and see my studio? There is nothing in it that deserves to last, I think. Still, one has patience with a child when he builds his brick houses, and you must have equal patience with me. Come!" And she led the way through her lovely room, which I now noticed was full of delicate statuary, fine paintings, and exquisite embroidery, while flowers were everywhere in abundance. Lifting the hangings at the farther end of the apartment, she passed, I following, into a lofty studio filled with all the appurtenances of the sculptor's art. Here and there were the usual spectral effects which are always suggested to the mind by unfinished plaster models: an arm in one place, a head in another, a torso or a single hand protruding ghost like from a fold of dark drapery. At the very end of the room stood a large erect figure, the outlines of which could but dimly be seen through its linen coverings, and to this work, whatever it was, Zara did not appear desirous of attracting my attention. She led me to one particular corner, and throwing aside a small crimson velvet curtain, said: "This is the last thing I have finished in marble. I call it Approaching Evening." I stood silently before the statue, lost in admiration. I could not conceive it possible that the fragile little hand of the woman who stood beside me could have executed such a perfect work. She had depicted Evening as a beautiful nude female figure in the act of stepping forward on tiptoe. The eyes were half closed, and the sweet mouth slightly parted in a dreamily serious smile. The right forefinger was laid lightly on the lips, as though suggesting silence, and in the left hand was loosely clasped a bunch of poppies. That was all. But the poetry and force of the whole conception, as carried out in the statue, was marvellous. "Do you like it?" asked Zara, half timidly. "Like it!" I exclaimed. "It's lovely, wonderful! It's worthy to rank with the finest Italian masterpieces." "Oh no!" remonstrated Zara. "No, indeed. When the great Italian sculptors lived and worked, one may say, with the Scriptures, there were giants in those days, giants, veritable ones, and we modernists are the pygmies. We can only see art now through the eyes of others who came before us. We cannot create anything new. We look at painting through Raphael, sculpture through Angelo, poetry through Shakespeare, philosophy through Plato. It is all done for us. We are copyists. The world is getting old. How glorious to have lived when it was young! But nowadays the very children are blasé." "And you, are not you blasé to talk like that, with your genius and all the world before you?" I asked laughingly, slipping my arm through hers. "Come, confess." "I sincerely hope the world is NOT all before me," she said. "I should be very sorry if I thought so. To have the world all before you in the general acceptation of that term means to live long, to barter whatever genius you have for gold, to hear the fulsome and unmeaning flatteries of the ignorant, who are as ready with condemnation as praise, to be envied and maligned by those less lucky than you are. Heaven defend me from such a fate!" She spoke with earnestness and solemnity, then dropping the curtain before her statue, turned away. I was admiring the vine wreathed head of a young Bacchante that stood on a pedestal near me, and was about to ask Zara what subject she had chosen for the large veiled figure at the farthest end of her studio, when we were interrupted by the entrance of the little Greek page whom I had seen on my first visit to the house. He saluted us both, and addressing himself to Zara, said: "Monsieur le Comte desires me to tell you, madame, that Prince Ivan will be present at dinner." Section 11 of A Romance of Two Worlds, by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7, Part 2. Zara and Prince Ivan. Zara looked somewhat vexed, but the shade of annoyance flitted away from her face like a passing shadow, as she replied quietly: "Tell Monsieur le Comte, my brother, that I shall be happy to receive Prince Ivan." The page bowed deferentially and departed. Zara turned round, and I saw the jewel on her breast flashing with a steely glitter like the blade of a sharp sword. "I do not like Prince Ivan myself," she said, "but he is a singularly brave and resolute man, and Casimir has some reason for admitting him to our companionship, though I greatly doubt if—" Here a flood of music broke upon our ears like the sound of a distant orchestra. Zara looked at me and smiled. "Dinner is ready," she announced, "but you must not imagine that we keep a band to play us to our table in triumph. It is simply a musical instrument worked by electricity that imitates the orchestra. Both Casimir and I prefer it to a gong." And slipping her arm affectionately through mine, she drew me from the studio into the passage, and together we went down the staircase into a large dining room, rich with oil paintings and carved oak, where Heliobas awaited us. Close by him stood another gentleman, who was introduced to me as Prince Ivan Petrovsky. He was a fine looking, handsome featured young man of about 30, tall and broad shouldered.
though beside the commanding stature of Heliobas his figure did not show to so much advantage as it might have done beside a less imposing contrast. He bowed to me with easy and courteous grace, but his deeply reverential salute to Zara had something in it of that humility which a slave might render to a queen. She bent her head slightly in answer, and still holding me by the hand, moved to her seat at the bottom of the table, while her brother took the head. My seat was at the right hand of Heliobas, Prince Ivan's at the left, so that we directly faced each other. There were two men servants in attendance, dressed in dark livery, who waited upon us with noiseless alacrity. The dinner was exceedingly choice. There was nothing coarse or vulgar in the dishes, no great heavy joints swimming in thin gravy a la Anglaise, no tureens of unpalatable sauce, no clumsy decanters filled with burning sherry or drowsy port. The table itself was laid out in the most perfect taste, with the finest Venetian glass and old Dresden ware, in which tempting fruits gleamed amid clusters of glossy dark leaves. Flowers in tall vases bloomed wherever they could be placed effectively, and in the centre of the board a small fountain played, tinkling as it rose and fell like a very faintly echoing fairy chime. The wines that were served to us were most delicious, though their flavour was quite unknown to me. One in especial, of a pale pink colour that sparkled slightly as it was poured into my glass, seemed to me a kind of nectar of the gods, so soft it was to the palate. The conversation, at first somewhat desultory, grew more concentrated as the time went on, though Zara spoke little and seemed absorbed in her own thoughts more than once. The Prince, warmed with the wine and the general good cheer, became witty and amusing in his conversation. He was a man who had evidently seen a good deal of the world, and who was accustomed to take everything in life a la bagatelle. He told us gay stories of his life in St. Petersburg, of the pranks he played in the Florentine Carnival, of his journey to the American States, and his narrow escape from the matrimonial clutches of a Boston heiress. Heliobas listened to him with a sort of indulgent kindness, only smiling now and then at the preposterous puns the young man would insist on making at every opportunity that presented itself.
"You are a lucky fellow, Ivan," he said at last. "You like the good things of life, and you have got them all without any trouble on your own part. You are one of those men who have absolutely nothing to wish for."
Prince Ivan frowned and pulled his dark moustache with no very satisfied air.
"I am not so sure about that," he returned. "No one is contented in this world, I believe. There is always something left to desire, and the last thing longed for always seems to be the most necessary to happiness." "The truest philosophy," said Heliobas, "is not to long for anything in particular, but to accept everything as it comes, and find out the reason of its coming." "What do you mean by the reason of its coming?" questioned Prince Ivan. "Do you know, Casimir, I find you sometimes as puzzling as Socrates." "Socrates? Socrates was as clear as a drop of morning dew, my dear fellow," replied Heliobas. "There was nothing puzzling about him. His remarks were all true and trenchant, hitting smartly home to the heart like daggers plunged down to the hilt. That was the worst of him. He was too clear, too honest, too disdainful of opinions. Society does not love such men." "What do I mean, you ask, by accepting everything as it comes, and trying to find out the reason of its coming? Why, I mean what I say. Each circumstance that happens to each one of us brings its own special lesson and meaning, forms a link or part of a link in the chain of our existence. It seems nothing to you that you walk down a particular street at a particular hour, and yet that slight action of yours may lead to a result you wot not of. 'Accept the hint of each new experience,' says the American imitator of Plato, Emerson. If this advice is faithfully followed, we all have enough to occupy us busily from the cradle to the grave." Prince Ivan looked at Zara, who sat quite thoughtful, only lifting her bright eyes now and then to glance at her brother as he spoke. "I tell you," he said with sudden moroseness, "there are some hints that we cannot accept, some circumstances that we must not yield to. Why should a man, for instance, be subjected to an undeserved and bitter disappointment?"
"Because," said Zara, joining in the conversation for the first time, "he has most likely desired what he is not fated to obtain." The Prince bit his lips and gave a forced laugh. "I know, madam, you are against me in all your arguments," he observed with some bitterness in his tone. "As Casimir suggests, I am a bad philosopher. I do not pretend to be more than the ordinary attributes of an ordinary man. It is fortunate, if I may be permitted to say so, that the rest of the world's inhabitants are very like me, for if everyone reached to the sublime heights of science and knowledge that you and your brother have attained, the course of human destiny would run out, and paradise would be an established fact," laughed Heliobas. "Come, Ivan, you are a true Epicurean. Have some wine, and a truce to discussions for the present." And beckoning to one of the servants, he ordered the Prince's glass to be refilled. Dessert was now served, and luscious fruits in profusion, including peaches, bananas, plantains, green figs, melons, pineapples, and magnificent grapes, were offered for our choice. As I made a selection for my own plate, I became aware of something soft rubbing itself gently against my dress, and looking down I saw the noble head and dark intelligent eyes of my old acquaintance, Leo, whom I had last met at Cannes. I gave an exclamation of pleasure, and the dog, encouraged, stood up and laid a caressing paw on my arm. "You know Leo, of course," said Heliobas, turning to me. "He went to see Raffaello while you were at Cannes. He is a wonderful animal, more valuable to me than his weight in gold." Prince Ivan, whose transient moodiness had passed away like a bad devil exorcised by the power of good wine, joined heartily in the praise bestowed on this four-footed friend of the family. "It was really through Leo," he said, "that you were induced to follow out your experiments in human electricity, Casimir, was it not?" "Yes," replied Heliobas, calling the dog, who went to him immediately to be fondled. "I should never have been much encouraged in my researches had he not been at hand. I feared to experimentalize much on my sister, she being young at the time, and women are always frail of construction. But Leo was willing and ready to be a victim to science, if necessary. Instead of a martyr, he is a living triumph. Are you not, old boy?" he continued, stroking the silky coat of the animal, who responded with a short low bark of satisfaction. My curiosity was much excited by these remarks, and I said eagerly: "Will you tell me in what way Leo has been useful to you? I have a great affection for dogs, and I never tire of hearing stories of their wonderful intelligence." "I will certainly tell you," said Heliobas. "To some people the story might appear improbable, but it is perfectly true, and at the same time simple of comprehension. When I was a very young man, younger than Prince Ivan, I absorbed myself in the study of electricity, its wonderful powers, and its various capabilities. From the consideration of electricity and the different forms by which it is known to civilized Europe, I began to look back through history to what are ignorantly called the Dark Ages, but which might more justly be termed the enlightened youth of the world. I found that the force of electricity was well understood by the ancients, better understood by them, in fact, than it is by the scientists of our day. The Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, that glittered in unearthly characters on the wall at Belshazzar's feast, was written by electricity. And the Chaldean kings and priests understood a great many secrets of another form of electric force, which the world today scoffs at and almost ignores. I mean human electricity, which we all possess, but which we do not all cultivate within us. When once I realized the existence of the fact of human electric force, I applied the discovery to myself, and spared no pains to foster and educate whatever germ of this power lay within me. I succeeded with more ease and celerity than I had imagined possible. At the time I pursued these studies, Leo here was quite a young dog, full of the clumsy playfulness and untrained ignorance of a Newfoundland puppy. One day I was very busy reading an interesting Sanskrit scroll, which treated of ancient medicines and remedies, and Leo was gambolling in his awkward way about the room, playing with an old slipper, and wearing it with his teeth. The noise he made irritated and disturbed me, and I rose in my chair and called him by name, somewhat angrily.
He paused in his game and looked up. His eyes met mine exactly. His head drooped. He shivered uneasily, whined, and lay down motionless. He never stirred once from the position he had taken till I gave him permission. And remember, he was untrained. This strange behaviour led me to try other experiments with him, and all succeeded. I gradually led him up to the point I desired, that is, I forced him to receive my thought and act upon it, as far as his canine capabilities could do, and he has never once failed. It is sufficient for me to strongly will him to do a certain thing, and I can convey that command of mine to his brain without uttering a single word, and he will obey me." I suppose I showed surprise and incredulity in my face, for Heliobas smiled at me and continued: "I will put him to the proof at any time you like. If you wish him to fetch anything that he is physically able to carry, and will write the name of whatever it is on a slip of paper, just for me to know what you require, I guarantee Leo's obedience."
I looked at Zara, and she laughed. "It seems like magic to you, does it not?" she said. "But I assure you it is quite true."
"I am bound to admit," said Prince Ivan, "that I once doubted both Leo and his master, but I am quite converted. Here, mademoiselle," he continued, handing me a leaf from his pocket book and a pencil, "write down something that you want. Only don't send the dog to Italy on an errand just now, as we want him back before we adjourn to the drawing room." I remember that I had left an embroidered handkerchief on the couch in Zara's room, and I wrote this down on the paper, which I passed to Heliobas. He glanced at it and tore it up. Leo was indulging himself with a bone under the table, but came instantly to his master's call. Heliobas took the dog's head between his two hands, and gazed steadily into the grave brown eyes that regarded him with equal steadiness. This interchange of looks lasted but a few seconds. Leo left the room, walking with an unruffled and dignified pace, while we awaited his return. Heliobas and Zara with indifference, Prince Ivan with amusement, and I with interest and expectancy. 2 or 3 minutes elapsed, and the dog returned with the same majestic demeanour, carrying between his teeth my handkerchief. He came straight to me and placed it in my hand, shook himself, wagged his tail, and conveying a perfectly human expression of satisfaction into his face, went under the table again to his bone. I was utterly amazed, but at the same time convinced. I had not seen the dog since my arrival in Paris, and it was impossible for him to have known where to find my handkerchief, or to recognize it as being mine, unless through the means Heliobas had explained. Section 12 of A Romance of Two Worlds by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7, Part 3. Zara and Prince Ivan. "Can you command human beings so?" I asked, with a slight tremor of nervousness. "Not at all," returned Heliobas quietly. "In fact, I may say very few. Those who are on my own circle of power I can naturally draw to or repel from me, but those who are not have to be treated by different means. Sometimes cases occur in which persons, at first not on my circle, are irresistibly attracted to it, by a force not mine. Sometimes, in order to perform a cure, I establish a communication between myself and a totally alien sphere of thought, and to do this is a long and laborious effort. But it can be done." "Then if it can be done," said Prince Ivan, "why do you not accomplish it for me?" "Because you are being forcibly drawn towards me without any effort on my part," replied Heliobas with one of his steady keen looks. "For whatever motive I cannot at present determine, but I shall know as soon as you touch the extreme edge of my circle. You are a long way off it yet, but you're coming in spite of yourself, Ivan." The Prince fidgeted restlessly in his chair and toyed with the fruit on his plate in a nervous manner. "If I did not know you to be an absolutely truthful and honourable man, Casimir," he said, "I should think you were trying to deceive me. But I have seen what you can do, therefore I must believe you. Still, I confess I do not follow you in your circle theory." "To begin with," returned Heliobas, "the universe is a circle. Everything is circular, from the motion of planets down to the human eye, or the cup of a flower, or a drop of dew. My circle theory, as you call it, applied to human electric force, is very simple, but I have proved it to be mathematically correct. Every human being is provided, internally and externally, with a certain amount of electricity, which is as necessary to existence as the life blood to the heart, or fresh air to the lungs. Internally, it is the germ of soul or spirit, and is placed there to be either cultivated or neglected as suits the will of man. It is indestructible, yet if neglected it remains always a germ, and at the death of the body it inhabits goes elsewhere to seek another chance of development. If, on the contrary, its growth is fostered by a persevering, resolute will, it becomes a spiritual creature, glorious and supremely powerful, for which a new brilliant and endless existence commences when its clay chrysalis perishes. So much for the internal electric force. The external binds us all by fixed laws, with which our wills have nothing whatever to do. Each one of us walks the earth encompassed by an invisible electric ring, wide or narrow according to our capabilities. Sometimes our rings meet and form one, as in the case of two absolutely sympathetic souls who labor and love together with perfect faith in each other. Sometimes they clash, and storms ensue, as when a strong antipathy between persons causes them almost to loathe each other's presence. All these human electric rings are capable of attraction and repulsion. If a man, during his courtship of a woman, experiences once or twice a sudden instinctive feeling that there is something in her nature not altogether what he expected or desired, let him take warning and break off the attachment, for the electric circles do not combine, and nothing but unhappiness would come from forcing a union. I would say the same thing to a woman. If my advice were followed, how many unhappy marriages would be avoided! But you have tempted me to talk too much, Ivan. I see the ladies wish to adjourn. Shall we go to the smoking room for a little, and join them in the drawing room afterwards?" We all rose. "Well," said the Prince gaily, as he prepared to follow his host, "I realize one thing which gives me pleasure, Casimir. If in truth I am being attracted towards your electric circle, I hope I shall reach it soon, as I shall then, I suppose, be more en rapport with Madame, your sister." Zara's luminous eyes surveyed him with a sort of queenly pity and forbearance. "By the time you arrive at that goal, Prince," she said calmly, "it is most probable that I shall have departed." And with one arm thrown round my waist, she saluted him gravely and left the room with me beside her. "Would you like to see the chapel on your way to the drawing room?" she asked, as we crossed the hall. I gladly accepted this proposition, and Zara took me down a flight of marble steps, which terminated in a handsomely carved oaken door. Pushing this softly open, she made the sign of the cross, and sank on her knees. I did the same, and then looked with reverential wonder at the loveliness and serenity of the place. It was small but lofty, and the painted dome shaped roof was supported by 8 light marble columns, wreathed with minutely carved garlands of vine leaves. The chapel was fitted up in accordance with the rites of the Catholic religion, and before the high altar and tabernacle burned 7 roseate lamps, which were suspended from the roof by slender gilt chains. A large crucifix, bearing a most sorrowful and pathetic figure of Christ, was hung on one side of the walls, and from a corner altar, shining with soft blue and silver, an exquisite statue of the Madonna and Child was dimly seen from where we knelt. A few minutes passed, and Zara rose. Looking towards the tabernacle, her lips moved as though murmuring a prayer, and then, taking me by the hand, she led me gently out. The heavy oaken doors swung softly behind us as we ascended the chapel steps and re-entered the great hall. "You are a Catholic, are you not?" then said Zara to me. "Yes," I answered, "but—" "But you have doubts sometimes, you would say. Of course, one always doubts when one sees the dissensions, the hypocrisies, the false pretences and wickedness of many professing Christians. But Christ and His religion are living facts, in spite of the suicide of souls He would gladly save. You must ask Casimir some day about these things. He will clear up all the knotty points for you.
Here we are at the drawing room." It was the same room into which I had first been shown. Zara seated herself and made me occupy a low chair beside her. "Tell me," she said, "can you not come here and stay with me while you are under Casimir's treatment?" I thought of Madame Denise and her pension. "I wish I could," I said, "but I fear my friends would want to know where I am staying, and explanations would have to be given, which I do not feel disposed to enter upon." "Why?" went on Zara quietly. "You have only to say that you are being attended by a Dr. Casimir, who wishes to have you under his own supervision, and that you are therefore staying in his house under the chaperonage of his sister." I laughed at the idea of Zara playing the chaperone, and told her she was far too young and beautiful to enact that character. "Do you know how old I am?" she asked, with a slight smile. I guessed 17, or at any rate not more than 20. "I am 38," said Zara. 38! Impossible! I would not believe it. I could not. I laughed scornfully at such an absurdity, looking at her as she sat there, a perfect model of youthful grace and loveliness, with her lustrous eyes and rose tinted complexion. "You may doubt me if you choose," she said, still smiling, "but I have told you the truth. I am 38 years of age according to the world's counting. What I am, measured by another standard of time, matters not just now. You see I look young, and what is more, I am young. I enjoy my youth. I hear that women of society at 38 are often faded and blasé. What a pity it is that they do not understand the first laws of self preservation! But to resume what I was saying, you know now that I am quite old enough in the eyes of the world to chaperon you or anybody. You had better arrange to stay here. Casimir asked me to settle the matter with you." As she spoke, Heliobas and Prince Ivan entered. The latter looked flushed and excited. Heliobas was calm and stately as usual. He addressed himself to me at once. "I have ordered my carriage, mademoiselle, to take you back this evening to the Avenue du Midi. If you will do as Zara tells you, and explain to your friends the necessity there is for your being under the personal supervision of your doctor, you will find everything will arrange itself very naturally. And the sooner you come here the better. In fact, Zara will expect you here to morrow early in the afternoon. I may rely upon you." He spoke with a certain air of command, evidently expecting no resistance on my part. Indeed, why should I resist? Already I loved Zara, and wished to be more in her company, and then most probably my complete restoration to health would be more successful and quickly accomplished if I were actually in the house of the man who had promised to cure me. Therefore I replied: "I will do as you wish, monsieur. Having placed myself in your hands, I must obey. In this particular case," I added, looking at Zara, "obedience is very agreeable to me." Heliobas smiled and seemed satisfied. He then took a small goblet from a side table and left the room. Returning, however, almost immediately with the cup filled to the brim, he said, handing it to me: "Drink this. It is your dose for to night, and then you will go home and straight to bed." I drank it off at once. It was delicious in flavour, like very fine Chianti.
"Have you no soothing draught for me?" said Prince Ivan, who had been turning over a volume of photographs in a sullenly abstracted sort of way. "No," replied Heliobas, with a keen glance at him. "The draught fitted for your present condition might soothe you too thoroughly." The Prince looked at Zara, but she was mute. She had taken a piece of silk embroidery from a work basket near her, and was busily employed with it. Heliobas advanced and laid his hand on the young man's arm. "Sing to us, Ivan," he said in a kind tone. "Sing us one of your wild Russian airs. Zara loves them, and this young lady would like to hear your voice before she goes." The Prince hesitated, and then, with another glance at Zara's bent head, went to the piano. He had a brilliant touch, and accompanied himself with great taste and delicacy, but his voice was truly magnificent, a baritone of deep and mellow quality, sonorous and at the same time tender. He sang a French rendering of a Slavonic love song, which, as nearly as I can translate it into English, ran as follows: "As the billows fling shells on the shore,
as the sun poureth light on the sea, as a lark on the wing scatters song to the spring, so rushes my love to thee. As the ivy clings close to the tower, as the dew lieth deep in a flower, as the shadow to light, as the day unto night, so clings my wild soul to thee. As the moon glitters coldly alone above earth on her cloud woven throne, as the rocky bound cave repulses a wave, so thy anger repulseth me. As the bitter black frost of a night slays the roses with pitiless might, as a sharp dagger thrust hurls a king to the dust, so thy cruelty murdereth me. Yet in spite of thy queenly disdain, thou art seared by my passion and pain. Thou shalt hear me repeat, till I die for it, sweet, I love thee, I dare to love thee. He ended abruptly and with passion, and rose from the piano directly. I was enthusiastic in my admiration of the song and of the splendid voice which had given it utterance, and the Prince seemed almost grateful for the praise accorded him by both Heliobas and myself. The page entered to announce that the carriage was waiting for mademoiselle, and I prepared to leave. Zara kissed me affectionately, and whispering, "Come early to morrow," made a graceful salute to Prince Ivan, and left the room immediately. Heliobas then offered me his arm to take me to the carriage. Prince Ivan accompanied us. As the hall door opened in its usual noiseless manner, I perceived an elegant light brougham, drawn by a pair of black horses, who were giving the coachman a great deal of trouble by the fretting and spirited manner in which they pawed the stones and pranced. Before descending the steps I shook hands with Heliobas, and thanked him for the pleasant evening I had passed.
"We will try to make all your time with us pass as pleasantly," he returned. "Good night. What, Ivan?" as he perceived the Prince attiring himself in his great coat and hat, "are you also going?" "Yes, I am off," he replied with a kind of forced gaiety. "I am bad company for anyone to night, and I won't inflict myself upon you. Casimir, au revoir. I will put mademoiselle into the carriage if she will permit me."
We went down the steps together, Heliobas watching us from the open door. As the Prince assisted me into the brougham, he whispered,
"Are you one of them?"
I looked at him in bewilderment. "One of them?" I repeated. "What do you mean?"
"Never mind," he muttered impatiently, as he made a pretence of covering me with the fur rugs inside the carriage. "If you are not now, you will be, or Zara would not have kissed you. If you ever have the chance, ask her to think of me at my best. Good night."
I was touched and a little sorry for him. I held up my hand in silence. He pressed it hard, and calling to the coachman, 36 Avenue du Midi, stood on the pavement bareheaded, looking singularly pale and grave in the starlight, as the carriage rolled swiftly away, and the door of the Hotel Mars closed. Section 13 of A Romance of Two Worlds by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8, Part 1. A Symphony in the Air. Within a very short time I became a temporary resident in the house of Heliobas, and felt myself to be perfectly at home there. I had explained to Madame Denise the cause of my leaving her comfortable pension, and she had fully approved of my being under a physician's personal care in order to ensure rapid recovery. But when she heard the name of that physician, which I gave, in accordance with Zara's instructions, as Dr. Casimir, she held up her fat hands in dismay. "Oh, mademoiselle!" she exclaimed, "have you not dread of that terrible man? Is he not he that is reported to be a cruel mesmerist who sacrifices everybody, yes, even his own sister, to his medical experiments? Ah, mon Dieu, it makes me to shudder!" And she shuddered directly, as a proof of her veracity. I was amused. I saw in her an example of the common multitude, who are more ready to believe in vulgar spirit rapping and mesmerism than to accept an established scientific fact. "Do you know Dr. Casimir and his sister?" I asked her. "I have seen them, mademoiselle, perhaps once, twice, 3 times. It is true madame is lovely as an angel, but they say," here she lowered her voice mysteriously, "that she is wedded to a devil. It is true, mademoiselle. All people say so. And Suzanne Michaud, a very respectable young person, mademoiselle, from Auteuil, she was employed at one time as under housemaid at Dr. Casimir's, and she had things to say, to make the blood like ice." "What did she say?" I asked with a half smile.
"Well,"
and Madame Denise came close to me and looked confidential,
"Suzanne, I assure you a most respectable girl, said that one evening she was crossing the passage near Madame Casimir's boudoir, and she saw a light like fire coming through the curtains of the portiere, and she stopped to listen, and she heard a strange music like the sound of harps. She ventured to go nearer. Suzanne is a brave girl, mademoiselle, and most virtuous, and to raise the curtain the smallest portion, just to permit the glance of an eye, and imagine what she saw."
"Well," I exclaimed impatiently, "what did she see?"
"Ah, mademoiselle, you will not believe me, but Suzanne Michaud has respectable parents, and would not tell a lie. Well, Suzanne saw her mistress, Madame Casimir, standing up near her couch with both arms extended as to embrace the air. Round her there was, believe it or not, mademoiselle, as you please, a ring of light like a red fire, which seemed to grow larger and redder always. All suddenly Madame grew pale and more pale, and then fell on her couch as one dead, and all the red fire went out. Suzanne had fear, and she tried to call out, but now see what happened to Suzanne! She was pushed from the spot, mademoiselle, pushed along as though by some strong personage, yet saw no one till she reached her own door, and in her room she fainted from alarm. The next morning Dr. Casimir dismissed her, with her full wages and a handsome present besides. But he looked at her, Suzanne said, in a manner to make her tremble from head to foot. Now, mademoiselle, judge yourself whether it is fit for one who is suffering with nerves to go to so strange a house."
I laughed. Her story had not the least effect upon me. In fact, I made up my mind that the so respectable and virtuous Suzanne Michaud had been drinking some of her master's wine. I said: "Your words only make me more desirous to go, Madame Denise. Besides, Dr. Casimir has already done me a great deal of good. You must have heard things of him that are not altogether bad, surely?" The little woman reflected seriously, and then said, as with some reluctance: "It is certainly true, mademoiselle, that in the quarter of the poor he is much beloved. Jean Duclos, he is a chiffonnier, had his one child dying of typhoid fever, and he was watching it struggling for breath. It was at the point to die. Monsieur le Comte Casimir, or Dr. Casimir, for he is called both, came in all suddenly, and in half an hour had saved the little one's life. I do not deny that he may have some good in him, and that he understands medicine, but there is something wrong." And Madame Denise shook her head forlornly a great number of times. None of her statements deterred me from my intention, and I was delighted when I found myself fairly installed at the Hotel Mars. Zara gave me a beautiful room next to her own. She had taken pains to fit it up herself with everything that was in accordance with my particular tastes, such as a choice selection of books, music, including many of the fascinating scores of Schubert and Wagner, writing materials, and a pretty full toned pianette. My window looked out on a small courtyard, which had been covered over with glass and transformed into a conservatory. I could enter it by going down a few steps, and could have the satisfaction of gathering roses and lilies of the valley, while outside the east wind blew and the cold snowflakes fell over Paris. I wrote to Mrs. Everard from my retreat, and I also informed the Challoners where they could find me if they wanted me. These duties done, I gave myself up to enjoyment. Zara and I became inseparables. We worked together, read together, and together every morning gave those finishing touches to the ordering and arrangement of the household which are essentially feminine, and which not the wisest philosopher in all the world has been, or ever will be, able to accomplish successfully. We grew to love each other dearly, with that ungrudging, sympathizing, confiding friendship that is very rarely found between two women. In the meantime my cure went on rapidly. Every night on retiring to rest Heliobas prepared a medicinal dose for me, of the qualities of which I was absolutely ignorant, but which I took trustingly from his hand. Every morning a different little phial of liquid was placed in the bathroom for me to empty into the water of my daily bath, and every hour I grew better, brighter, and stronger. The natural vivacity of my temperament returned to me. I suffered no pain, no anxiety, no depression, and I slept as soundly as a child, unvisited by a single dream. The mere fact of my being alive became a joy to me. I felt grateful for everything, for my eyesight, my speech, my hearing, my touch, because all my senses seemed to be sharpened and invigorated and braced up to the keenest delight. This happy condition of my system did not come suddenly. Sudden cures mean sudden relapses. It was a gradual, steady, ever increasing, reliable recovery. I found the society of Heliobas and his sister very fascinating. Their conversation was both thoughtful and brilliant, their manners were evenly gracious and kindly, and the life they led was a model of perfect household peace and harmony. There was never a fuss about anything. The domestic arrangements seemed to work on smoothly oiled wheels. The different repasts were served with quiet elegance and regularity. The servants were few, but admirably trained, and we all lived in an absolute calm atmosphere, unruffled by so much as a breath of worry. Nothing of a mysterious nature went on, as far as I could see. Heliobas passed the greater part of the day in his study, a small, plainly furnished room, the facsimile of the one I had beheld him in when I had dreamed those 3 dreams at Cannes. Whether he received many or few patients there I could not tell, but that some applied to him for advice I knew, as I often met strangers crossing the hall on their way in and out. He always joined us at dinner, and was invariably cheerful, generally entertaining us with lively converse and sparkling narrative, though now and then the thoughtful tendency of his mind predominated and gave a serious tone to his remarks. Zara was uniformly bright and even in her temperament. She was my very ideal of the Greek Psyche, radiant yet calm, pensive yet mirthful. She was full of beautiful ideas and poetical fancies, and so thoroughly untouched by the world and its aims that she seemed to me just to poise on the earth like a delicate butterfly on a flower, and I should have been scarcely surprised had I seen her unfold a pair of shining wings and fly away to some other region. Yet, in spite of this spirituelle nature, she was physically stronger and more robust than any other woman I ever saw. She was gay and active; she was never tired, never ailing, and she enjoyed life with a keen zest such as is unknown to the tired multitudes who toil on hopelessly and wearily, wondering, as they work, why they were born. Zara evidently had no doubts or speculations of this kind. She drank in every minute of her existence as if it were a drop of honeydew prepared specially for her palate. I never could believe that her age was what she had declared it to be. She seemed to look younger every day. Sometimes her eyes had that limpid, lustrous innocence that is seen in the eyes of a very little child, and again they would change and glow with the earnest and lofty thought of one who had lived through years of study, research, and discovery. For the first few days of my visit she did not work in her studio at all, but appeared to prefer reading or talking with me. One afternoon, however, when we had returned from a short drive in the Bois de Boulogne, she said half hesitatingly: "I think I will go to work again to morrow morning, if you will not think me unsociable." "Why, Zara dearest," I replied, "of course I shall not think you unsociable. I would not interfere with any of your pursuits for the world." She looked at me with a sort of wistful affection, and continued: "But you must know I like to work quite alone, and though it may look churlish, still not even you must come into the studio. I never can do anything before a witness. Casimir himself knows that, and keeps away from me." "Well," I said, "I should be an ungrateful wretch if I could not oblige you in so small a request. I promise not to disturb you, Zara. Do not think for one moment that I shall be dull. I have books, a piano, flowers. What more do I want? And if I like I can go out. Then I have letters to write and all sorts of things to occupy me. I shall be quite happy, and I shall not come near you till you call me." Zara kissed me. "You are a dear girl," she said. "I hate to appear inhospitable, but I know you are a real friend, that you will love me as much away from you as near you, and that you have none of that vulgar curiosity which some women give way to, when what they desire to see is hidden from them. You are not inquisitive, are you?" I laughed. "The affairs of other people have never appeared so interesting to me that I have cared to bother myself about them," I replied. "Bluebeard's chamber would never have been unlocked had I been that worthy man's wife." "What a fine moral lesson the old fairy tale teaches!" said Zara. "I always think those wives of Bluebeard deserved their fate for not being able to obey him in his one request. But in regard to your pursuits, dear, while I am at work in my studio, you can use the grand piano in the drawing room when you please, as well as the little one in your own room, and you can improvise on the chapel organ as much as you like." I was delighted at this idea, and thanked her heartily. She smiled thoughtfully. "What happiness it must be for you to love music so thoroughly!" she said. "It fills you with enthusiasm. I used to dislike to read the biographies of musical people. They all seemed to find so much fault with one another, and grudged each other every little bit of praise wrung from the world's cold, death doomed lips. It is to me pathetically absurd to see gifted persons all struggling along, and rudely elbowing each other out of the way, to win what? A few stilted commonplace words of approbation or fault finding in the newspapers of the day, and a little clapping and shouting from a gathering of ordinary minded persons, who only clap and shout because it is possibly the fashion to do so. It is really ludicrous. If the music the musician offers to the public be really great, it will live by itself and defy praise or blame. Because Schubert died of want and sorrow, that does not interfere with the life of his creations. Because Wagner is voted impossible and absurd by many who think themselves good judges of musical art, that does not offer any obstacle to the steady spread of his fame, which is destined to become as universal as that of Shakespeare. Poor Joachim, the violinist, has got a picture in his private house in which Wagner is painted as suffering the tortures of hell. Can anything be more absurd when we consider how soon the learned fiddler, who has occupied his life in playing other people's compositions, will be a handful of forgotten dust, while multitudes yet to come will shout their admiration of Tristan and Parsifal? Yes, as I said, I never cared for musical people much, till I met a friend of my brother's, a man whose inner life was an exquisite harmony." "I know!" I interrupted her. "He wrote the letters of a dead musician." "Yes," said Zara. "I suppose you saw the book at Raffaello's studio? Good Raffaello Cellini! His is another absolutely ungrudging and unselfish spirit. But this musician that I speak of was like a child in humility and reverence. Casimir told me he had never sounded so perfect a nature. At one time he, too, was a little anxious for recognition and praise, and Casimir saw that he was likely to wreck himself on that fatal rock of poor ambition. So he took him in hand and taught him the meaning of his work, and why it was especially given him to do, and that man's life became one grand sweet song. But there are tears in your eyes, dear. What have I said to grieve you?" And she caressed me tenderly. The tears were indeed thick in my eyes, and a minute or two elapsed before I could master them. At last I raised my head and endeavoured to smile. "They are not sad tears, Zara," I said. "I think they come from a strong desire I have to be what you are, what your brother is, what that dead musician must have been. Why, I have longed and do long for fame, for wealth, for the world's applause, for all the things which you seem to think so petty and mean. How can I help it? Is not fame power? Is not money a double power, strong to assist one's self and those one loves? Is not the world's favour a necessary means to gain these things?" Zara's eyes gleamed with a soft and pitying gentleness. "Do you understand what you mean by power?" she asked. "World's fame? World's wealth? Will these things make you enjoy life? You will perhaps say yes. I tell you no. Laurels of earth's growing fade. Gold of earth's getting is good for a time, but it palls quickly. Suppose a man rich enough to purchase all the treasures of the world. What then? He must die and leave them. Suppose a poet or a musician so famous that all nations know and love him. He too must die and go where nations exist no longer. And you actually would grasp ashes and drink wormwood, little friend. Music, the heaven born spirit of pure sound, does not teach you so." I was silent. The gleam of the strange jewel Zara always wore flashed in my eyes like lightning, and anon changed to the similitude of a crimson star. I watched it, dreamily fascinated by its unearthly glitter. "Still," I said, "you yourself admit that such fame as that of Shakespeare or Wagner becomes a universal monument to their memories. That is something, surely?" "Not to them," replied Zara. "They have partly forgotten that they ever were imprisoned in such a narrow jail as this world. Perhaps they do not care to remember it, though memory is part of immortality." "Ah!" I sighed restlessly. "Your thoughts go beyond me, Zara. I cannot follow your theories." Zara smiled. "We will not talk about them any more," she said. "You must tell Casimir. He will teach you far better than I." "What shall I tell him?" I asked. "And what will he teach me?" "You will tell him what a high opinion